Artem died on Wednesday. On the most ordinary, gray day between his thesis defense and an evening game of strategy. Tram number 7 didn't stop. Artem didn't have time to jump out of the way. 28 years of life ended with a wet thud on the tracks. His last thought was dull and bitter. His thesis had been accepted. He didn't even have time to celebrate. Darkness. No light at the end of the tunnel. No angels. No damn boot screen. It was just turned off like a light bulb. And then turned on. But it was a different light bulb. The first thing Grix felt was a smell, so thick and sour that it stung his eyes. It smelled of rotten earth and urine and something else that made his stomach lurch up into his throat. The second thing he felt was pain. His whole body ached as if he'd been chewed up and spat out. He tried to open his eyes. He managed it on the third try. The world was green. Not in the sense of grass and trees. His own hands were green. Small, twisted fingers with dirty, broken claws. 3 fingers and a thumb. He brought them up to his face. The face wasn't his either. A sharp nose, protruding ears, a mouth full of tiny teeth. He sat up. His head spun. All around him, in the cramped earthen pit, sat creatures. Dozens of them. Green. Small. They were scratching themselves, grumbling and shoving one another. Goblins. He was sitting among goblins. He was a goblin. Artem's brain refused to accept this for exactly 4 seconds. On the 5th second, another part of his consciousness kicked in. The very part that had spent 8 years reading about the fall of empires and the rise of nations from the mud. The part that had spent 3,000 hours on strategies for building states from nothing. This part didn't panic. This part was already calculating. Someone kicked him in the side. Grix fell to the ground. Standing over him was a goblin twice his size. By goblin standards, it was a giant. A broad snout with a scar across the left eye. Fists like 2 boulders. Mord. The name came to him on its own. The memory of this body was still working in fragments. Mord barked something in Goblin. Grix didn't understand right away. The language was rough and terse. The words sounded more like barking, but the meaning got through. Get up. Meet. Let's go. Fight. Die. Grix looked around. The pit turned out to be a camp, if you could call a pile of burrows in the clay a camp. All around were goblins of the Rotten Root tribe, over 30 of them, skinny, dirty, eyes as empty as those of stray dogs. The body's memory came back in fragments. He is Grix, junior commander, the most useless position in the tribe. The junior commander is the one they push out first to face the enemy. Bait, lure, disposable material among disposable material. The very bottom of the barrel. Mord kicked him again, harder. The other goblins around him cackled, a thin, shrill laugh. Grix got to his feet.
The body was pitiful. Barely waist-high to a human. Thin bones, muscles like strings. He could feel every rib beneath his skin. You couldn't fight with this body. With this body, you could only run and hide and die. The body's memory gave him another piece of information. Today they're being driven to a human fort. An orc commander named Drak Gar had sold the Rotten Root tribe to a human baron as a test attack. The goblins would charge the walls, the humans would shoot. While the humans were shooting at the goblins, the orcs would count the archers and find their weak spots. Then the orcs would launch the real attack. And by that point, all that will remain of the goblins are patches on the grass. It's always been this way. 300 years. Goblins run, goblins fall. Goblins die. Orcs win. No one remembers the names of the dead goblins because no one writes them down. Because goblins have no writing. Because no one ever thought it necessary to give them letters. Grix stood in the crowd of his tribe and watched them. 33 goblins. 8 of them are too old. 5 are too young. The remaining 22 are capable of holding a stick. Not a sword, not a spear, a stick. Because goblins aren't allowed weapons. Orcs give them sharpened branches and kick them toward the enemy.
Artem's mind was working, quickly and coldly. He had seen this before. Not in this world. In books. In a 240-page dissertation that had been accepted 3 hours before his death. He wrote about small peoples, about those who were considered filth and trash and cannon fodder. The Mongols were nomads whom the Chinese called savages. Then Temujin came, and the savages built the greatest empire in history. Rome began as a filthy village on a hill. All around were the Etruscans and the Greeks and the Gauls, all stronger, all richer. Everyone despised the Romans. And then the Romans devoured them all, not because they were stronger, but because they were more organized. Numbers. Grix thought in numbers. There are more goblins on this continent than humans, elves, and orcs combined. Everyone knew that, and everyone considered it unimportant. Because the goblins are split into hundreds of tribes that tear each other apart, because they have no weapons and no discipline and no leader. Alone, they're rats. But if you gather them together, if you give them formation and weapons and a goal, the thought was so immense that Grix forgot to breathe for a second. The blare of an orcish horn brought him back to reality. Time. They were lined up, 33 goblins in a crooked line. Ahead, across the field, stood a human fort. Wooden walls, towers with archers, a moat. To humans, it was a minor outpost. To goblins, it was a meat grinder. An orc overseer marched along the line, huge, green skin darker than the goblins, fangs like daggers. He stopped in front of Grix, looked him up and down. He smirked. He said the junior commander would run first, and if he didn't run fast enough, the orcs would kill him before the humans did. Grix looked up at him. He saw the orc, but he wasn't thinking about the orc. He was thinking about how the orc's horn would sound in a minute, that in 5 minutes, most of his tribe would be dead, that in 10 minutes, the orcs would go to count the bodies and record their observations of the human fort, and the goblins' bodies would be left to rot in the field, nameless, without graves, as always. The horn sounded. The goblins ran, squealing and stumbling, with sticks in their hands, toward the walls where archers were already climbing. Grix ran too, but not forward. He darted to the right, toward the ravine he'd spotted back when they were being led to their position. One of the goblins saw this. One turned after him, then a second, then 5 more. Herd instinct, the most reliable mechanism in a goblin's mind. If one runs, the rest run after him. Grix didn't look back. He dove into the ravine, rolled down the wet clay, scraped his elbows and knees, pressed himself against the bottom. Goblins rained down from above. 1, 3, 7, 12. They fell on him and on top of each other, whimpering in fear. Sounds came from the field, the whistling of arrows, short shouts, the dull thud of bodies. Then silence. Then an orcish horn, the signal to stand down. The goblins had fulfilled their purpose. Those who had run to the walls. Grix lay at the bottom of the ravine. 12 goblins lay around him, shivering, terrified, but alive. The other 21 would never return. He knew it. 12 pairs of eyes stared at him, yellow, round, animal-like. But there was something in them that Grix hadn't expected. A question. They looked at him and waited. For the first time in his life, someone had run not toward death, but away from it, and they had run after him, and survived. Grix sat down, wiped the clay from his face, looked at the 12 goblins. Each one could fit in a backpack. Each one stank so badly it made his eyes water. Each one had sticks instead of weapons. They had been sent to their deaths as bait. And they had survived, because one of them had run the wrong way. Grix opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He thought of Temujin. He too had started with a handful, with those who had been cast out and betrayed. He thought of Romulus, of Moses, of every one of those who took the outcasts and made a people out of them. They all started like this, in the mud, in fear, with a handful of people nobody wanted.
He spoke. The goblin language came to him with difficulty. The words were rough and short, but he spoke. He said they could sit here and wait until the orcs found them and killed them for desertion, or they could follow him. He said he didn't know exactly where, but he knew there was a place where goblins weren't beaten, because he would build it. Silence. 12 goblins exchanged glances. One of them was bigger than the others. Mord, a scar across his eye, fists like rocks. The very one who'd kicked him that morning. Mord stared at Grix for a long time. Then he spat, and said that Grix was a fool. But a fool who was alive, and those who'd run to the walls were dead. So fine, he'd follow the fool, because the smart goblins always lead them to their deaths. Maybe he'd have better luck with the fool. Grix nodded. He stood up. His legs were shaking. His body felt foreign, weak, and pitiful. But his mind was working, and his mind already knew. Today there were 12 of them. Tomorrow there would be 20. In a month, 300. In a year, thousands. He just needed time, and a ravine where he could start. He led them south, away from the fort, away from the orcs, into a dense forest where no one would look for goblins because no one looks for trash. They walked in silence, 12 green figures in the twilight, small, pitiful, frightened. But for the first time in their short lives, they were not going where they were being driven. They were walking where they had chosen to go. Let the choice have been made by a fool in ragged clothes, but it was their choice. The first in the history of the Rotten Root tribe. 2 hours later they found a place, a narrow gorge between 2 rock walls, one entrance, a stream inside. Thick brush blocked the passage. Grix stopped. He examined the walls. He examined the entrance. He examined the ground. Soft, clayey, easy to dig. Artem's mind kicked into high gear. He didn't see a gorge. He saw a position. A narrow passage where the enemy could only enter 2 at a time. Walls from which stones could be dropped. Ground in which pits could be dug. Bushes behind which archers could be hidden, if they had any. But there were no archers. There were 12 goblins with sticks and fear in their eyes. Grix turned to them. He told them to dig. He showed them where. He showed them how deep. He showed them how to sharpen stakes from branches and place them at the bottom of the pits. The goblins looked at him. Mord asked why. Grix answered briefly. He said that people would come for them. They always do. The squad clearing the field after the battle will find that bodies are missing. They'll follow the tracks. And when they arrive, they must not find an empty ravine, but a trap. Mord grunted. Then he picked up a stick and began digging. The others looked at Mord. If the biggest goblin is digging, then it's okay. It means there's no shame in it. Herd instinct again. Grix remembered that. Herd instinct. The most powerful weapon in goblin society. Point it in the right direction, and you move the crowd. They dug all night. Grix didn't dig. He directed. He placed the pits in a checkerboard pattern. He showed them how to camouflage them with branches and leaves. He showed them where to stack stones at the edge of the walls, where to place stakes so that a retreating enemy would run into them. 12 goblins worked. For the first time, not because they were being beaten, but because someone had explained why. In the morning, the ravine looked the same. Grix checked. Nothing visible from the outside. Inside, 12 pits with stakes, a pile of stones on the walls, 3 rows of sharpened branches in the bushes, all made of sticks, earth, and stones. Nothing that required a smithy or magic, just hands and a mind. He sat down at the entrance. He waited. They appeared around noon. A human detachment. 8 soldiers, chainmail, swords, shields, one with a crossbow. They walked confidently, following the goblins' tracks. A tracker in front showed the way. Grix heard their voices. They were laughing. One said that goblin tracks were easy to find because they stink. Another said they'd be done by dinner time and would return. 8 men, in armor, with weapons, against 12 naked goblins with sticks. For the men, it wasn't even a challenge. It was a cleanup. They entered the gorge. The first one fell through on his third step. A scream. A crunch. The stakes pierced his leg right through his chainmail pants. The second one rushed to him and fell into the next pit. Another scream. Grix raised his hand. The goblins on the walls began throwing rocks. Not aimed. Goblins couldn't aim. But in a narrow gorge, accuracy wasn't needed. Rocks flew down, onto heads, onto shoulders, onto the shields the men raised too late. One soldier tried to run back. He stumbled into stakes in the brush. Another fell into the pit. A crossbowman fired upward. The bolt vanished into thin air. It was impossible to shoot at the goblins behind the stones on the wall. They were too small, too short. The cracks in the stones hid them completely. The battle lasted 4 minutes.
4 minutes of screams and the rumbling of stones and the crunch of stakes and the screeching of goblins, who were screeching not out of fear, but out of something new. They were screeching with rage. For the first time in their lives, the enemy was below and they were above. For the first time, they weren't the ones falling into pits. For the first time, the stones weren't flying at them. When it grew quiet, Grix climbed down. His legs were shaking. His hands were shaking. He nearly fell twice. 8 human soldiers lay in the ravine, 4 in pits, 2 under rocks, 1 on stakes. 1 was crawling toward the exit, dragging a broken leg. Mord approached the one crawling. He looked at Grix. Grix nodded. Mord struck him with a stick, a heavy one. Once. Silence. Grix stood among the bodies and counted. 8 men in chainmail and with swords. 12 goblins with sticks and pits in the ground. Goblin casualties? 0. 0. He turned to his own men. 12 goblins stood at the edge of the walls and looked down. They looked at the dead men. They looked at Grix. Their hands were shaking. Some had tears streaming down their faces. But they weren't crying out of grief. They were crying because, for the first time in their lives, they had won. Because in the entire history of the Rotten Root tribe, not a single goblin had ever stood over a dead enemy, whole and unharmed. Because someone small and weak and useless had told them to dig, and they had dug their way to victory with their bare hands. Mord approached Grix. He stood before him. The very same Mord who that morning had kicked him in the leg that very morning. He looked down at him, and for the first time in his life, he was the first to lower his gaze. He said one word: Chieftain. Grix stood in a narrow ravine smeared with blood and clay. 12 goblins were looking at him, with something new in their yellow eyes, with something that had never been there before, with hope. Grix hadn't slept all night after the battle. 12 goblins were snoring in a heap by the stream. Some were hugging their trophy swords the way children hug rag dolls. The swords were too big for them. A human short sword is a 2-handed weapon for a goblin, but they didn't let them go even in their sleep. The first real weapons of their lives. Grix sat at the entrance to the gorge and thought. Artem's mind sorted through the situation. 12 fighters, 8 sets of chainmail, 8 swords, 1 crossbow and 14 bolts for it, 3 knives, water flasks, hardtack and sacks. It was more than the entire Rotten Root tribe had possessed over the past 10 years. But it wouldn't last even a week. 12 mouths to feed, hardtack for 3 days. There's enough water in the stream, but the food will run out, and then the goblins will start to scatter. The herd instinct works both ways. When they're well-fed and safe, they stick together. When they're hungry, they scatter. Every man for himself. They'd lived like that for 300 years. It had worked for 300 years. Or rather, it hadn't worked. But they knew no other way. Grix pulled a flint from the dead soldier's bag. He struck a spark. He built a small fire against the wall. The goblins feared fire. His body's memory told him that goblins only build fires on the coldest nights, and even then, only small ones, which they hide in pits. Because fire attracts those who are bigger. Humans, orcs, even beasts. For a goblin, fire is a beacon that tells the whole world, here we are, come and kill us. But Grix didn't build the fire for warmth. He sat down in front of it and stared at the flames. He needed to think. A plan. Without a plan, 12 goblins in the gorge are just 12 goblins who will die 3 days later than the rest. With a plan, they're a start. First, food. Goblins knew how to gather roots and catch small creatures. Beetles, lizards, frogs. It wasn't an army ration, but they wouldn't starve to death. The problem was that to gather food, they had to leave the gorge, and it was dangerous outside. A human fort was half a day's journey away. Orcs were somewhere to the north. Any patrol would devour them without a second thought. Second, numbers. 12 is nothing. Grix remembered from his dissertation that the minimum viable group is 50, less than 50, and a single skirmish, a single disease, a single mistake wipes them all out. So he needs more goblins. And there are goblins all around. Dozens of small tribes in these woods. His body's memory offered fragments. The yellow mushroom tribe, the wet bone tribe, the rat tail tribe. All small, all of them hungry, all of them fighting each other over scraps. Third, weapons. 8 swords is good, but swords aren't suitable for goblins. Their arms are short, they lack strength. A single blow from a human knight sends a goblin with a sword flying 3 paces away. The swords need to be modified, or come up with something else. Something suited to a goblin's size and strength. Grix thought about a crossbow, the one they took from the dead man. Heavy. Impossible for a goblin to lift. But the principle is simple. A mechanism that stores power and releases it with a single click. A goblin doesn't need big muscles to pull the trigger. He only needs muscles to cock the bow. And if they made the crossbow small, suited to goblin hands, weaker than a human's. But if there were 30 such crossbows and they all fired at once... Grix smiled. His teeth were small and sharp. A goblin's smile looked terrifying. But in the darkness of the gorge, no one saw it. In the morning, he woke everyone up. The goblins woke up groggily. They grumbled. They snarled. One tried to bite another on the ear simply because he was lying too close. Grix barked in Goblin. His voice was thin and hoarse. Not commanding, but the goblins froze. Yesterday was still fresh in their minds. They remembered the stones falling down. They remembered the people in the pits. They remembered the word Mord had spoken that evening. Chieftain. Grix laid out the spoils before them. Swords, chainmail, a crossbow, bolts, knives, food. The goblins stared with greedy eyes. They reached out their hands. Grix said to stop. Their hands froze. He said the food would be divided equally. Silence. The goblins exchanged glances. Equally. A word that practically didn't exist in the goblin language. Among goblins, the strong get the food. The rest fight over the scraps. The chieftain eats first. Then his inner circle. Then everyone else, if anything is left. That's how it's always been. Grix said that from now on, things would be different. Everyone would get an equal share, because he needs all 12 of them alive and able to move. A goblin dead from starvation is useless. A goblin weakened by starvation is useless. He needs well-fed ones. He didn't talk about fairness. The goblins wouldn't have understood. He talked about utility. That's what they understood. Mord looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Took his share. No more. The rest followed suit. Herd instinct. Grix noted this again. Mord was the key. Where Mord went, the rest followed. The largest goblin in the tribe. The Alpha. In Goblin society, the Alpha is everything. If the Alpha accepts a new leader, the pack accepts him. If the Alpha hesitates, the pack falls apart. Grix had to keep Mord close. Not by force. He has no strength. By results. As long as Mord sees that it's in his best interest to follow Grix, he'll follow. As soon as he stops seeing that, he'll snap Grix's neck and lead the rest into the forest. After breakfast, Grix divided the tribe into groups. 3 goblins to hunt, 3 to gather roots and mushrooms, 3 to gather firewood and branches, 3 to stay in the gorge, digging, expanding the pits, setting new stakes. The goblins listened. Not because they understood why, but because yesterday, those who listened to Grix survived, and those who didn't are lying in the field in front of the human fort. That argument is stronger than any words. Grix sent the groups off and stayed with the 3 diggers. He stood by the gorge wall and began to draw, with a stick on the clay, a map of the gorge, the entrance, the pits, Positions on the walls, lines of fire, retreat routes. The goblins looked at the drawing. To them, it was just scribbles. They didn't understand maps, didn't understand diagrams, didn't understand that a line on the clay meant a path and a circle meant a pit. Grix spent an hour explaining. He poked the circle with his stick and said, pit. He poked the line and said, path. He poked the cross and said, enemy. He repeated it 3 times. The goblins began to nod, slowly, with difficulty, but they began. It was a start. Not writing, not yet, but the first step toward it. If a goblin can understand that a mark on clay represents a thing in reality, then a goblin can learn symbols. That means an alphabet can be created. That means orders can be written down. That means the army can function without shouting and without having to pass every order from mouth to mouth. Grix was always thinking 3 steps ahead. Always. The hunters returned by evening. They brought 4 rats and a handful of beetles. The gatherers brought a basket of roots and wet mushrooms. Not much, but it was enough for 12 goblins. Grix divided it equally again. Again, Mord took his share first and no more. Again, the rest followed suit. Habit. Grix was building a habit. In a week, they would stop thinking that food was divided equally. They would simply divide it. Like breathing, like blinking. Habit is stronger than a command. A command works as long as the leader is watching. Habit works all the time. On the 3rd day, Grix took 3 goblins and went on a reconnaissance mission. Mord wanted to go with him. Grix said no. He said Mord was needed in the gorge. If anyone attacked, Mord would have to command the defense. Mord narrowed his eyes. He wasn't stupid. He understood that Grix was making him important, giving him a bit of power, binding him. But that understanding didn't stop it from working. Mord nodded and stayed. Grix led the trio south. The forest was dense, old. The trees were so thick that 3 goblins couldn't wrap their arms around them. Moss hung from the branches. The ground was soft and wet. Ideal territory for goblins. A large man or an orc would struggle to make their way through such a forest. A goblin slips through like a lizard. For once, small size was an advantage. An hour later, they stumbled upon tracks. Small footprints. Goblin footprints. Grix crouched down. The tracks were fresh. There were many of them, 20 or more, heading east. He followed the tracks. Carefully. 2 goblins were following him. The 3rd had fallen behind. Grix turned and gestured for him to stay closer. The goblin ran up, eyes wide with fear. The forest is full of sounds that a goblin hears better than a human. Every crunch is a possible death. Half and up, Grix saw the camp, if you could call it a camp. A pit in the ground beneath the roots of a huge tree. Goblins were sitting in the pit, many of them. Grix counted 22, skinny, ragged, several wounded, 3 young ones. One old goblin woman with a tuft of gray hair on her head and a pouch around her neck that smelled of herbs. The yellow mushroom tribe, his body's memory told him. A neighboring tribe. Not allies, not enemies. Just another bunch of green ones trying not to die by tomorrow. Grix stopped his men. He thought. 22 goblins. If added to his 12, that would make 34, already closer to 50. But goblin tribes don't unite. Never. For 300 years they've been fighting each other over every burrow and every bug. A foreign tribe is an enemy. Maybe a weak enemy, but still an enemy. Entering a foreign camp is a challenge. The yellow mushroom chieftain is obliged to respond, with a fight or with expulsion. The goblins know no third option. Grix stepped out into the open. He raised his hands, empty, unarmed. The goblins in the pit squealed. They jumped up, grabbed sticks. The yellow mushroom chieftain leaped forward, small even for a goblin, one-eared, with a bone club that looked like someone's shin bone. He bared his teeth and growled. Grix stood. He didn't move. He waited. The one-eared chieftain lunged forward and swung his club. Grix didn't budge. The club stopped an inch from his temple. The one-eared chieftain looked at him. Grix looked at the one-eared chieftain. Quietly and calmly, he said he hadn't come to fight, that he'd brought food, and he turned to his men. One of his goblins pulled out a sack. Inside was half of today's haul. Rats and roots. Grix placed the sack on the ground in front of the one-eared chieftain. The chieftain stared at the food. The goblins behind him stared at the food. The young ones whimpered. The one-eared chieftain looked at Grix. Something resembling confusion flashed in his yellow eyes. A goblin does not bring food to a foreign tribe. A goblin? Goblins steal food from other tribes. It had always been that way. Grix spoke, slowly, in short sentences. He said that his tribe, the Rotten Root, lived nearby, that they had a ravine, they had traps, they had real weapons, and there was a place for those who wanted to eat every day, not every other day, not when luck was on their side, every day. The one-eared one-ear looked at him, then at the sack, then at the three goblins behind Grix. He saw a knife on one of their belts, a real human knife, made of steel. The one-eared goblin's eyes went wide. He asked where it came from. Grix replied that he had killed people. Silence. Absolute. Even the young fell silent. Goblins don't kill people. People kill goblins. That's how the world works. The one-eared goblin licked his lips. He asked how many people. Grix replied, 8. The one-eared goblin blinked. He looked at his tribe. 22 hungry goblins, 3 of them children, 4 wounded. They had no weapons except sticks and a single bone club. They had no food except what this stranger had put on the ground. He looked at Grix again. Said that Grix was lying, that no single goblin could kill 8 people. Grix nodded. Said that 1 couldn't, but 12 could, if they dug pits and threw stones, and that 34 could do even more. One-eared remained silent. A female goblin with a small bag of herbs stepped forward. She looked at Grix intently, very intently. Her eyes weren't yellow, but dark, almost black, a rarity among goblins. She didn't say a word. She just nodded to the one-eared goblin. He spat, put away his club, said that if Grix was lying, he'd personally rip his liver out. But they'd go by morning. Take a look. If there were no weapons and no traps in the gorge, they'd leave and take the food with them. Grix agreed. In the morning, the one-eared goblin saw the gorge. He saw pits with stakes. He saw stones on the walls. He saw swords and chainmail and a crossbow. He saw how Grix's 12 goblins divided the food equally, silently, without a fight, without growling. Equally. One-ear watched this for a long time. Then he turned to his tribe. He said they were staying. That evening, 34 goblins sat around the fire. 2 tribes, side by side for the first time in their lives. They didn't fight. They didn't growl. They ate. Equal shares. The yellow mushroom goblins glanced sideways at the rotten root goblins. The latter glanced back, but no one touched another's portion, because Mord sat next to Grix and watched. And everyone knew that Mord would break the arm of anyone who took more than their share. Grix sat by the fire and looked at 34 green faces. Dirty, skinny, frightened, but alive. And sitting together for the first time, not because they'd been herded there, but because they'd chosen to. He needed 50. He had 34. Somewhere in these woods, dozens more small tribes roamed, hungry, beaten, broken by 3 centuries of slavery. He would find them, one by one, and for now, each the same thing: food, weapons, and victory. Because a goblin doesn't believe in words. Words are cheap. A goblin believes only what he sees. Show him what he can eat every day. Show him a steel knife. Show him a dead enemy, and he will follow you. An old goblin woman from the yellow mushroom sat down next to Grix when the others had fallen asleep. She introduced herself. Usha, a healer. She looked at him with her dark eyes and said nothing. Then she said a strange thing. She said that in the old songs that no one sings anymore, there are words about a leader who will come from nowhere, who will speak like a stranger, think like a stranger, and lead the green people from the mud to the sky. Grix froze. Usha leaned closer. Her voice became quiet. She said she could hear him speak, that the words were right, but his mouth moved wrong, that he thought before saying every word in Goblin, as if he were translating in his head, as if his real language were another. Grix was silent. His heart pounded in his frail green chest. Ushsa said she didn't know who he was, and didn't want to know. But whatever he was the first in 300 years to give the goblins food and not strike them. And that was enough for her. She got up and went back to her people. Grix watched her go. The old goblin woman had noticed something no one else had. He was a stranger in this body, and she decided to keep quiet, not for his sake, for the sake of the goblins to whom someone had given hope for the first time. Grix lay down on the ground. He closed his eyes. Above the gorge, the stars of a foreign world shone, constellations Artem didn't know. The moon was larger than Earth's and had a greenish tint. Beautiful. If you forget that you're green and small and that the whole world considers you trash. He didn't forget. He counted. 34 today, 50 next week, 100 in 2 weeks, 300 in a month. Numbers. Always numbers. Because there is power in numbers. The only power the goblins have. On the 5th day, Grix realized there wasn't enough. 34 mouths aren't the same as 12. The hunters brought back rats and lizards. The gatherers hauled in roots and mushrooms. But the forest around the gorge had already been picked clean. Every day the groups ventured farther and farther out, and the farther you go, the greater the chance of running into trouble. A human patrol. An orc patrol. A foreign goblin tribe that won't talk, but will simply attack and take the spoils. Grix gathered everyone in the morning. He said they needed to set snares. The goblins exchanged glances. They knew what snares were. A loop of sinew on the trail. That's how you catch small game. But Grix had something else in mind. He crouched down and drew a diagram in the clay. Not a single noose, but a line of 20 snares, across the entire animal trail to the stream, each one 3 paces from the next. The beast would bypass one and fall into the next. Mass capture. The conveyor belt principle. The goblins didn't know the word conveyor, but they understood the principle. Many traps nearby. The beast won't get through. Grix sent 10 men to set the snares, another 5 to dig new pits around the ravine. Not inside, but outside. A ring of traps at the approaches. If anyone approaches their home, they'll know about it from the screams in the pit. An early warning system made of sticks and clay. The rest worked inside. Grix ordered them to clear the bottom of the gorge, remove the debris, lay out a spot for a fire with stones, dig a latrine away from the stream. The goblins didn't understand why. They relieved themselves wherever they happened to be. That's how they'd always done it. Grix explained it simply. He said that if you shit in the stream you drink from, you'll get sick, and a sick goblin can't dig or hunt. That means others will have to work for him. That means everyone will eat less. An argument through the stomach. The only one that worked without fail. The goblins dug the latrine. Grumbling, grumbling. But they dug it. Ushsa approached Grix that evening. She said he was a strange chieftain. Other chieftains beat and yell. He explains. Grix replied that a beaten goblin does just enough to avoid being beaten again. But a goblin who understands why does more. Ushsa snorted. She said that those were wise words. Too wise for a goblin. Grix said nothing. Neither did Ushsa. They understood each other. On the 6th day, the snares yielded results. 7 rabbits in one night. 7. The goblins stared at the catch with wide eyes. 7 rabbits is a feast, a celebration. The tribe of Rotten Root hadn't seen in a single sitting in the past year. Grix didn't let them start a feast. He divided the meat into portions, some for today, some to salt. There was no salt, but Ushsa knew a herb that kept the meat from rotting for 2 or 3 days, a bitter, astringent herb that grew by the stream. Grix remembered. Preservation. Primitive. But for the goblins, it was a revelation. You didn't have to devour the meat right away. You could save it for tomorrow. The idea was so foreign to the goblin mindset that 3 of them refused. They took their portion and gobbled it up on the spot. The rest looked at Grix. He didn't scold those 3. He simply said that tomorrow, those who had saved their meat would eat.
And those who had gobbled theirs up would work on an empty stomach.
The next day, the 3 hungry ones watched as the rest chewed on the preserved meat. On the 3rd day, they too began to save some. No shouting, no beatings. Hunger teaches faster than any stick. On the 7th day, Grix turned his attention to weapons. 8 captured swords lay against the wall of the gorge. Beautiful. Useless. A goblin with a human sword is like a child with a sledgehammer. Heavy. Clumsy. One swing and you're wide open. Grix picked up one of them. He turned it over in his hands. Heavy. The blade was as long as his leg. The hilt was made for a human hand. A goblin's fingers could barely wrap around it. But the steel was good. It could be reworked. The question was how. There was no forge, no bellows, no anvil. Nothing but a fire and some stones. Grix thought. He wasn't a blacksmith. Artem was a historian. He knew what a 13th century smithy looked like. He knew the principle. A forge is a pit with coals and a bellows for air. An anvil is a flat, heavy stone. A hammer is a stone on a stick. Primitive, rough, but enough to heat the steel and reforge it. He found a flat stone by the stream. Wide, heavy, smooth on top. He ordered 2 goblins to drag it to the fire. He dug a pit for the forge, lined it with stones, piled coals from the fire into it. He needed a bellows, a tube to blow air into the coals. No bamboo, no reeds. But there was a bone. A shin bone from which the one-eared chieftain of the yellow mushroom had made himself a club, hollow inside. Grix asked the one-eared chieftain for the bone. The chieftain said he wouldn't give it up. It was his weapon. Grix proposed a trade, the bone for a steel knife. The one-eared chieftain grabbed the knife so quickly he nearly cut his fingers. The bone went to Grix. He stuck it into the furnace pit. He made the goblin blow. The coals glowed red hot. Not quite red hot, but hot. Hot enough to soften the steel. Maybe. Grix placed the sword in the coals. He waited. The goblin blew. His cheeks puffed out. Sweat rolled down his green face. An hour later, the blade was red hot. Not white, not orange, dark red. A faint glow. But Grix pulled it out with stones wrapped in wet hide and laid it on a flat rock. He took another stone in his hand and began to strike. Crooked, weak. Sparks flew to the side. The blade bent unevenly. The first blow was a disgrace. The second was barely better. By the 10th, Grix realized he didn't have enough strength. A goblin's body was too frail for forging. He called out to Mord, showed him where to strike. Mord struck. The stone crashed down on the red-hot steel. A ringing sound echoed through the gorge. The blade flattened. Too much. Grix corrected him. He showed him to strike more gently. Mord struck more gently. Better. They worked all day. The result was ugly. The long human sword had turned into a short, wide blade. Rough. Uneven. With nicks. But short. Suited to a goblin's hand. Grix weighed it. 3 times lighter than a human sword. You could hold it with one hand. You could strike quickly. Not hard, but fast. And if you put your whole body weight into the strike and aim for an unprotected spot, it'll be enough. Mord took the new blade, swirled it in his hand, bared his teeth. Not out of anger, out of pleasure. The first weapon made by goblins for goblins. He looked at Grix and said the chieftain was cunning. Grix didn't answer. He looked at the remaining 7 swords and counted. 7 swords meant 7 short blades, plus 1 ready-made one. 8. 8 armed goblins. Not enough. But the crossbow. Grix walked over to the captured crossbow. Heavy. A wooden stock. A steel bow. A sinew string. A lever-operated cocking mechanism. A goblin could cock it if he lay on his back and braced his feet against the bow. Awkward, slow, but possible. A goblin could fire it, too. No aiming. Hands shake. Eyes aren't right. Can't judge distance. But if firing from 20 paces in a narrow gorge, it's hard to miss. Grix was thinking about small crossbows, made for a goblin's hand. A bow made of flexible wood, not steel, 4 times weaker than a human's. The bolt won't pierce chainmail, but it will pierce leather armor. It will pierce a face. It will pierce a throat. It would pierce an unprotected arm. And if there were 20 such crossbows, all firing simultaneously from 20 paces, you could wipe out a squad before it reached you. He began sketching on clay, a diagram of a small crossbow, a stock made from a stick, a bow made from a bent branch, a string made from braided sinew, a trigger made from a splinter. Simple, rough, but repeatable. Any goblin who knows how to cut a stick can assemble one in a day. A young goblin sat down nearby, small, even smaller than Grix, with long, thin fingers. He looked at the drawing. Not like the others. The others looked and saw scribbles. This one looked and saw an object. Grix noticed. He asked his name. Pix. He asked what he saw. Pix poked the drawing with a thin finger and said the arch would break. Too thin for that kind of tension. It needs to be thicker in the middle and thinner toward the edges. Grix froze. He looked at the drawing. He looked at Pix. The goblin didn't know a single word of engineering terminology. He didn't know what load distribution was. He didn't know what material fatigue was. But he looked at the drawing of a stick that was supposed to bend and unbend 1,000 times and instantly understood where it would break. Intuitive engineering. A gift. Raw and wild, but a gift. Grix smiled his eerie goblin smile and said that Pix would make crossbows. Pix blinked. He looked at his hands. Long, thin fingers. The other goblins laughed at them. They said he had a girl's hands, that he couldn't hold a club like a normal goblin. Grix said that any fool could hold a club, but no one in the tribe could do what Pix would do. Pix straightened up, just a little, almost imperceptibly, but Grix saw it. Give a goblin a task he's good at, a task only he can do, and you'll get not a slave, but a master. Artem knew this from history. The guild artisans of medieval Europe, the freest people in the least free of times, because they knew how to do what others couldn't, and for that they were valued. Pix went into the forest and returned with an armful of branches. He sorted through each one, bent them, sniffed them, discarded 3/4, kept 5. Flexible, strong, made of some local wood that Grix didn't know. Pix knew. He said it was ironwood. It bends but doesn't break. Grix let him get to work. By evening the next day, Pix brought the first crossbow. Small, rough, ugly, just like its creator. The stock was made from a stick. Somewhat had been roughly planed with a stone. The bow was made from a branch of ironwood, thicker in the center, thinner toward the edges, just as he'd said. The string was made of rabbit sinews braided into a plate. The trigger was a splinter on a string. Grix took it. Lightweight. You could hold it with one hand. You can draw it with 2 hands without using your feet. He aimed at a tree at the other end of the gorge. He pulled the trigger. The splinter clicked. A bolt made from a sharpened stick flew 30 paces and stuck into the bark. Not deep, about 2 fingers worth. It won't pierce chainmail. It'll pierce the skin. Grix looked at Pix. He was standing there, wringing his long fingers, waiting, afraid they'd say it was bad, that they'd hit him. Grix said it was good. Then he said he needed 20 of those, and better, a stronger bow, a longer stock for the sight, bolts made of bone, not wood. A bone tip goes in deeper. Pix nodded. His eyes were burning. For the first time, someone had told him it was good. For the first time, someone had asked him to do what he knew how to do. He went to his corner of the gorge and worked until dawn. By the end of the 10th day, Grix had 34 goblins, 8 short blades, 3 crossbows made by picks. Each one was better than the last. A ring of traps around the ravine, 2 days' worth of food, a primitive horn, and the beginnings of something Grix couldn't yet name. Not a tribe, something bigger. Order. On the morning of the 11th day, Grix woke to a scream. One of the lookouts he'd posted at the entrance to the gorge was shrieking and pointing toward the forest. Grix ran out. Goblins were coming out of the forest toward the gorge. Many. Grix counted. 20, 30, 40. They were emerging behind the trees and out from behind the bushes. Dirty, battered. Some were limping. One had a severed arm wrapped in a rag. Another was missing an ear. A fresh wound. Blood was still flowing. A goblin larger than the rest walked in front. Not as burly as Mord, but sturdy, with an axe. A real orcish axe. Rusty and jagged, but real. He stopped in front of Grix, looked down at him, introduced himself. Chief Rattail. Grix nodded. His body's memory prompted Rattail, a medium-sized tribe. There had been about 50 of them. Now, judging by the looks of it, there were 40-something left. Rattail's chieftain said the orcs had attacked them, not for war, for recruitment. The orc chieftain Drakgar is gathering goblins for the next attack. Those who don't go willingly are taken by force. Rattail refused. Drakgar sent a dozen orcs. They slaughtered half the tribe. The rest fled. They fled south, into the forest. And they heard from one of the smaller tribes that there was a goblin in the south, a strange goblin, who killed people, who feeds strangers, who sets traps. Rattail's chief looked at Grix. There was no hope in his eyes. There was anger. A heavy, murky anger-driven beast. He said he didn't care about strange goblins or traps or pretty words. He needed a place for his tribe. If Grix gave them a place, they would stay. If not, they would take what they could and leave. A threat. Subtle. 40 goblins with orcish axes against 34 with 8 blades. Not the most favorable odds for an attack. But Rattail's chieftain was wounded and angry and cornered. And a cornered beast is dangerous. Grix looked at him, then at his tribe. Battered, hungry, frightened. Children clung to their mother's legs. The wounded could barely stand. He'd seen this before. In books. Refugees. On every page of every war. People who had been driven from their homes and were going anywhere just to get away. Grix said there was a place, and there was food, and there would be weapons. But there was a rule. 1. Food would be divided equally, for everyone. His goblins and the newcomers. The chief and the youngest cub would receive the same. Anyone who didn't agree could leave. The rat-tailed chieftain narrowed his eyes. He said that chieftains don't do that. Grix replied that the chieftains who don't do that have led the goblins to where they are now, into the mud, into flight, into slavery. But he would lead them to a different place, but only if everyone eats the same, because a hungry goblin in his camp is his problem, and there should be no problems in his camp. Rat-tail's chieftain was silent for a long time. Then he looked at his wounded, at the children, at the goblin woman holding a dead cub in her arms, unable to let go. He lowered his axe. He said, "All right, equal shares. Let it be equal shares." That evening, there were 76 goblins in the gorge, 3 former tribes, 3 former chieftains, 1 campfire, food for everyone, an equal share. Grix stood by the wall and watched them. 76, more than 50. Critical mass. Now this wasn't a handful of fugitives. Now this was a group that could survive losses and not fall apart. A group that can hunt, defend itself, and grow. Grix turned to Mord. He said quietly that the real work begins tomorrow. Mord asked what kind. Grix answered with one word. Army. An army doesn't start with weapons. An army starts when 76 goblins stop being 3 tribes and become 1. Grix understood this better than anyone. Artem had written his dissertation on exactly this, on the moment when a crowd becomes a people. And that moment always begins with one thing, with a name. On the morning of the 12th day, Grix gathered everyone. The goblins sat in a circle. 3 former tribes, 3 former chieftains. Mord stood behind Grix. The one-eared chieftain of the yellow mushroom sat on the right. The chieftain of Rat Tail sat on the left. He held an axe on his lap. He didn't trust them yet. Grix spoke. He said that as of today, there was no longer a Rotten Root tribe. There is no Yellow Mushroom tribe. There is no Rat Tail tribe. Silence. The goblins exchanged glances. The rat-tail chieftain gripped his axe. The one-eared one flinched. Even Mord, standing behind him, tensed. Grix raised his hand. He said there was one tribe, a new one, without old names, without old grudges, without blood feuds between clans. One tribe, one name, one set of laws. And that name was Horde. The word fell into the silence like a stone into water. The goblins were silent. The word was familiar. Horde. That's what the orcs called their gatherings. Large. Terrifying. Those very hordes that drove the goblins to slaughter. The one-eared chieftain stood up. He said it was an orcish word, that the goblins had nothing to take from the orcs. Grix shook his head. He said the word did not belong to the orcs. The word belongs to whoever fills it with meaning. The orcs have filled it with fear. The goblins will fill it with pride. When humans and orcs and elves hear the word horde, they won't think of orcs. They'll think of a green wall from which bolts fly. The one-eared chieftain sat down, not convinced, but shut up, for now. Grix continued. He said that there are no tribal chiefs in the horde. There is one leader, him, and there are commanders whom he appoints. Chief Rattail stood up, hand on his axe. He said he would not obey a puny upstart who couldn't lift a stone. Grix looked at him, calmly. He said he understood, that Rattail's chief was strong and powerful, and his goblins respected him, and so he would be the commander of the left wing. The chief blinked. He asked what the left wing was. Grix explained. When the horde stands in formation, it divides into 3 parts: center, left wing, right wing. The wing commander is responsible for his fighters. He trains them, leads them into battle. He is no less than a chieftain. It's more, because the chieftain leads a tribe of 50, but a wing commander will lead hundreds when they come. Chieftain Rattail was silent. He was counting. Goblins aren't good at counting, but they know the concepts of more and less perfectly well. Hundreds are more than 50, so a wing commander is more important than a chieftain. He sat down. He took his hand from the axe. He said he would listen. For now. Grix nodded. For now. That was enough. He announced the commanders. Mord commands the center. Rattail's chieftain commands the left wing. One Ear commands the right. Each commander is responsible for his own section, feeds them, trains them, maintains order. But everyone answers to Grix. Everyone follows the common laws. The laws. Grix knew this was the next step. He spent the rest of the morning by the gorge wall, drawing on clay. Not a map. Symbols. Simple ones. A circle is a goblin. 2 circles side by side are 2 goblins together. A stick pointing up is good. A stick pointing down means bad. A triangle means food. A square means weapon. A wavy line means water. A cross means enemy. Primitive, childish, but every goblin could memorize them in a day, and everyone could understand a message laid out with these signs on the ground or scratched into the bark. Grix gathered the goblins after lunch. He showed them the symbols. He explained each one. 3 times. Then he made them repeat them. The goblins got confused. They cursed. One mixed up the food symbol with the enemy symbol, and everyone burst out laughing. But by evening, most had memorized the basics. A circle, a stick, a triangle, a cross. 12 symbols. The first goblin writing system. Not an alphabet. Pictograms. Like the Sumerians. Like the early Egyptians. The very beginning. Grix ordered everyone to scratch their symbol into a stone. Anyone. Whichever you want. It will be your name, your mark. The goblins exchanged glances. Name, mark. They knew their names, but goblin names were sounds, a growl and a click. They were born and died, and no one remembered their names because there was nothing to write with and nowhere to write. Mord was the first to take a stone. He scratched a short vertical line with a notch into the gorge wall. He looked at it. He grunted. That was him. Mord. The notch. The next one stepped up and scratched his mark. And the next. And the next. By evening, the entire wall of Tout was covered in marks. 76 marks. Crooked. Ugly. But each one belonged to a specific goblin. Usha stood before the wall and said nothing. Grix approached. She turned to him. Her dark eyes gleamed. She said quietly that in 300 years not a single goblin had left a mark that would outlive him. The goblins were born and died like raindrops, gone in an instant. But now, each one had a mark on the stone, and when that goblin died, the mark would remain, and someone would look at it and remember that such a goblin had existed. Grix nodded. He said this was only the beginning. He said that soon there would be not just marks, but real letters, and not on the walls of the cave, but on paper, and not just names, but stories, laws, orders, maps. Everything a people need to be a people. Usha shook her head. She said he scared her. Not because he was evil, but because he saw what no goblin had seen in 1,000 years. She fell silent again. Then she added quietly, that there's a line in the old songs that once upon a time goblins had letters, real letters, and books, and stone walls, and then it all disappeared. Someone took it away. Grix froze. He asked who. Usha shrugged. She said the songs don't say, only that there was someone gray, and after him, the goblins became what they became. Rats. Filth. Meat. Gray. Grix remembered. Something about that word caught his attention, like a thorn under the skin. But now was not the time. Now was the army. The next morning, Grix began drill training. To call it an army would be an insult to any army. 76 goblins stood in the ravine trying to line up. It turned out haphazardly. The goblins jostled. They jostled. One bit another. 3 sat down on the ground because they were tired of standing. Grix yelled. His voice was thin, unconvincing. The goblins didn't listen well. Mord yelled. His voice was like a rock fall. The goblins listened better. The team was working, Grix thought. Mord yelled. 2 in formation, 5 in formation, 10. The principle was simple. A phalanx. The oldest battle formation in history. Shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. There were no shields, but the principle was the same. Stand close together. Don't scatter. Hold the line. If you run, you expose your neighbor. If you leave your neighbor exposed, he dies, and you die next, because 1 goblin is a dead goblin. But 10 goblins, shoulder to shoulder, are a wall. Small, green, but a wall. Grix made them stand in line for an hour. Just stand. Don't move, don't push, don't bite. Stand. After 10 minutes, 5 of them sat down. Mord picked them up. After 20 minutes, 3 tried to leave. Mord brought them back. After 30 minutes, 1 peed right in the line because he didn't know if he could go out. Grix said he could, but quickly and back. After an hour, they were standing. A bit crooked, but standing. 76 goblins in 3 ranks. The first time in the history of these 3 former tribes. The first time in the history of the goblin people. Because goblins didn't form ranks. Goblins ran in a mob, toward the enemy or away from the enemy. No one had ever told them to stand side by side and not move, because no one had ever considered a goblin capable of discipline. Grix looked at the crooked ranks and saw something else. He saw a wall of shields. 3 rows.
The first row with short blades behind homemade shields. The second row with spears behind the backs of the first. The third row with crossbows. Volley, reload, volley. The enemy charges the wall. The first row takes the brunt of the attack. The second row strikes from behind the shields.
The third row stops firing and draws their blades. 3 rows, like Roman maniples, like a Macedonian phalanx, like any formation that defeated chaos through organization. But they were far from that. Right now they couldn't even stand straight. Grix let them rest. Then he lined them up again. An hour of standing, a break. An hour of standing. By evening, the goblins were standing straighter. Not perfectly straight, but straighter. Mord walked along the line and corrected them, with a kick or a word. More often with a kick. Grix didn't forbid it. For now. In a week, it would be with a word. In a month, neither would be needed. Habit. It's all habit. On the 14th day after rebirth, Grix stood at the edge of the gorge and looked at the camp. In 2 weeks, the gorge had changed. Pit traps formed a ring around it. Lookout posts at both ends. A horn by the wall. 5 finished short blades lay nearby. Mord was forging the 6th. It was turning out better. His hands had memorized the process. Pix sat in the corner assembling his 5th crossbow. Each one was better than the last. The 5th had a range of 40 paces and could drive 3 fingers deep into wood. Not a human crossbow, but perfect for a goblin's body. Meat was drying on poles by the stream. 3 days' worth of provisions. The goblins had learned to preserve food, with difficulty, with a struggle, but they had learned. 76 goblins live by a schedule. Morning drill, work after lunch, hunting and gathering in the evening, night watch. Not everyone was happy. The goblins grumbled, they snarled, they fought a few times. One of Rat-Tail's goblins stole someone else's portion. Mord broke his finger. Grix told Mord that you can't break fingers. A fingerless goblin can't hold a weapon. Mord asked, "What then?" Grix thought it over and imposed a punishment. The thief goes without food for 1 day. Not a finger, not a beating. Hunger. A goblin understands hunger better than pain. Pain passes and is forgotten. Hunger is remembered. On the 15th day, Zara arrived. Alone. Without a tribe. A little goblin girl. Even smaller than Grix. Quick as a lizard. She slipped past all the traps and walked past both sentries, appearing in the center of the camp as if she had sprung from the ground. Mord nearly knocked her head off. She dodged it. Easily. As if she knew in advance where the fist would come from. Grix stopped Mord. He looked at the goblin girl. She was dirtier than the rest. Thinner, with a long scar across her face from forehead to chin. Her eyes were quick. They looked everywhere at once. She said her tribe was dead. The orcs had killed them. All of them. She survived because she was in the forest when they came. She returned and saw the corpses. She went wherever her eyes took her. She heard about Grix from 2 goblin vagabonds. She came. Grix asked what she could do. Zara said she could hide. And find those who were hiding. And walk so that no one could hear her. And see better at night than during the day. Grix asked how she'd gotten past the sentries and through the traps. Zara shrugged, said the sentries were asleep, both of them. And you can see the traps if you look at the ground instead of straight ahead. The ground where there's a hole is softer, the leaves are fresher. Grix turned to Mord. Mord gritted his teeth. He ran toward the sentries. Grix looked at Zara again. Reconnaissance. Eyes and ears. Any army is blind without reconnaissance. The Romans had explorers. The Mongols had advanced patrols 100 miles ahead of the main horde. Without reconnaissance, you don't know where the enemy is. You don't know how many there are. You don't know when they'll come. Zara was perfect. Small. Quiet. Invisible. And vicious. Vicious with the quiet, calm malice of someone who has lost everything and has nothing left to lose. Grix said he had a job for her. Zara asked what it was. Grix replied that she would have to walk through the forest.
to find other goblin tribes, to count them, to remember where they live and how many there are, and to watch where the orcs are, where the humans are, where their patrols go, how often, how many in each. Zara looked at him for a long time. Then she asked why. Grix replied that it was because soon he would need to know everything that was happening in this forest, every trail, every camp, every patrol, because he was going to do what no goblin had done in 300 years. Zara asked what exactly. Grix answered with one word: win. Zara looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then she nodded. She turned and vanished into the bushes so quietly that Grix didn't hear a sound. He stood there, staring at the spot where she had just been. Mord returned. He said the sentries had been beaten and wouldn't be sleeping anymore. Grix nodded. He looked at the ravine. At 77 goblins. At the wall with the name tags. At the horn and the crossbows and the formation that was learning to stand straight. 2 weeks ago, he had woken up in the body of a nobody. In a body that had been sent to its death. In a body that the whole world considered expendable. Now he had 77 fighters, a weaponsmith, a healer, a scout, 3 commanders, a camp with traps and supplies, and the beginnings of something that, in a month, could be called an army. Not enough. Insignificantly little by the standards of this world. A human baron would field 1,000 soldiers. The orc chieftain Drakgar would lead 3,000. The elves would send their archers who never miss at 200 paces. Against them stood 77 goblins with sticks and homemade crossbows. But Grix was not afraid. He knew what no one else on this continent knew, that numbers matter. There are hundreds of thousands of goblins on Valandor, maybe millions, divided into hundreds of tribes, hungry, oppressed, but alive, and every single one of them wakes up every day and thinks the same thought, that he is trash, that it has always been so and always will be, that a goblin is born a slave and dies a slave. Grix was going to prove that this thought was a lie. One goblin after another, one tribe after another, until there were so many of them that the world would be forced to look down and see that the trash had risen, and that the trash had a structure, and crossbows, and names on the wall. Zara returned on the 3rd day, silently. She appeared by the fire like a shadow. Even the new sentries, whom Mord had personally trained after the disgrace, didn't notice her. Grix began to think it wasn't the sentries' fault. Zara was simply better. She sat down in front of Grix and began to speak. Briefly, to the point, without unnecessary words. Grix listened and drew on the clay. 2 hours' walk to the north stands an orc camp. 120 orcs. Drakgar, his main encampment. Tents made of hides. Pens for captive goblins. Zara saw about 40 of them in the pens. They're kept like livestock, fed once every 2 days, beaten every day, prepared for the next attack on the human fort. Between the orc camp and Grix's Gorge are 3 trails. 2 are wide. Orc patrols walk along them, in 5s, twice a day, morning and evening. The 3rd path is narrow, a game trail. Orcs don't use it, too narrow for orc shoulders, just right for a goblin. 4 hours' walk to the west lies the human fort, the very one where most of the Rotten Root tribe perished. Zara got close. She counted about 50 soldiers. The walls have been repaired. The moat has been deepened. The humans are expecting an orc attack and are preparing. To the east are 3 small goblin tribes: Mouseclaw, Black Clay, White Worm. Each has between 15 and 25 members. All are hungry. All are battered. Mouseclaw hides in a cave by the river. Black Clay lives in a pit under a fallen tree. White Worm roams and doesn't even have a permanent lair. To the south, the forest stretches far. Zara reached its edge in a single day. There are hills there, rocky, empty. No humans, no orcs, no goblins. But there are caves, large, deep. And in one of them, Zara found something strange.
She fell silent. Grix looked at her. Zara took a fragment from her bosom. She placed it on the ground in front of Grix. A stone, flat, smoothly hewn. Lines were carved into it. Not scratches, not random marks. Lines, straight, clear, forming a pattern. Grix picked up the fragment, turned it over. His heart skipped a beat. He had seen this before. In textbooks, in museums, in photographs of Sumerian tablets and Egyptian stelae. These were symbols, not the pictograms he himself had drawn on clay. Real symbols, complex, with curves and intersections. A system, a writing system, a goblin writing system. Ancient. Usha approached. She looked at the stone. Her dark eyes widened. She reached for the shard with trembling fingers. She picked it up, brought it to her face, traced the symbols with the tip of a claw. Her lips moved. She was reading. No, not reading. She was recalling. Fragments of old songs that contained sounds similar to these symbols. She couldn't read a single word, but she recognized the shapes, like a person who heard a language in childhood and forgot it but remembers the melody. Usha looked at Grix. She said it was real, that the legends hadn't lied, that goblins once wrote and read and built with stone. Grix nodded. He said that Zara had found the place, and he wanted to see it. But not now. Right now there were more important matters. 40 goblins in the orc's pen. Zara said that 10 orcs were guarding the pens, in shifts, 5 during the day, 5 at night. The remaining 110 were at the main camp. The distance between the pen and the main camp was about 100 paces. Shouts from the pen could be heard at the camp. Grix was drawing on clay. Zara looked at his drawings. She corrected them. Here the path veers left. Here a tree has fallen. Here a stream. The map turned out crooked but accurate. Grix looked at it and thought. 40 goblins. If we free them, there will be 117. Almost 150. A serious force. But 10 orc guards aren't the same as 8 human soldiers in a narrow gorge. An orc is a killing machine. 2 meters of muscle, skin as thick as leather armor, heavy bones. A punch shatters a goblin's skull. A blow from an axe splits a goblin in 2. 1 orc in open combat is worth 10 goblins, maybe 20, in open combat. Grix had no intention of fighting in open combat. He gathered the commanders in the evening. Mord, One Ear, the leader of Rat Tail, Zara, Pix, Usha. He laid out a map drawn on clay. He pointed out the orc camp. He pointed out the pens. He pointed out the trails. He said they would go at night, along a narrow animal trail that orcs don't use. 25 fighters, the best, with crossbows and blades. The rest would stay in the gorge, under One Ear's command. Rat-Tail Chief asked why. Why risk 25 for the sake of 40 foreign goblins? Grix answered in 3 words. Because they're ours. Rat-Tail Chief didn't understand. Grix explained. Every goblin on this continent is a potential horde fighter. Every one. Those 40 in the pen aren't strangers. They're goblins, which means they're ours. Rat-Tail Chieftain was silent. Then he nodded. Not out of understanding, out of respect for the madness. Mord said he'd go first. Grix said Zara would go first, because Zara is the only one who knows the way and can move quietly. Mord would go second, with the main group. Grix would go with them. Mord said no. He said a chieftain doesn't go into battle. A chieftain sits and thinks. If the chieftain is killed, who will think? Grix looked at Mord. Mord was right. Absolutely right. A commander does not march in the front ranks. That is the first rule of any military doctrine, from Sun Tzu to Clausewitz. But Grix had no choice. He was the only one who knew the plan, the only one who could make a decision on the spot if something went wrong. And something was bound to go wrong. No plan survives contact with the enemy. Grix said he would go, and that's not up for discussion. Mord gritted his teeth. but he nodded. They stepped out into the night. 25 goblins, 10 with crossbows, 10 with blades, 5 with ropes made of braided tendons. Zara was in front, invisible, silent. She walked 20 paces ahead of the main group and stopped them 3 times. The first time was when a shadow of an orc patrol flashed ahead on the wide trail. 5 orcs passed within 40 paces. They didn't notice. The second time was when a snake lay on the trail, a big one, a poisonous one. Zara went around it. She showed the others. The third time was when the smell of smoke from an orc campfire wafted out of the darkness, close by. Grix froze. He inhaled. The smell of meat. Roasted meat. And something else. Goblin sweat. The pens were nearby. Zara returned. She gestured. A pen ahead, behind the trees. 3 orcs by the fire. 2 are walking in a circle. 5 are sleeping in the tent on the left. The main camp is 100 paces to the right. Voices and rumbling came from there. The orcs weren't asleep yet. Grix counted. 3 by the fire, 2 on guard. 5 are sleeping. 10 in total. If we take them out quietly, the main camp won't find out. If even one screams, 110 will come running, and that's the end. Quiet. We have to be quiet. Grix gestured to position the archers. 5 on the right behind the bushes. 5 on the left behind the trees. 10 paces from the campfire. Aim at those 3, on command, simultaneously. Mord, with 10 blades, waits behind the shooters. As soon as the shooters fire, Mord and the blades will run to the tent with the 5 sleeping men. Finish them off before they wake up. 2 sentries remain. Zara. Grix looked at her. She nodded. Without asking, she understood. She vanished into the darkness. Grix waited. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like the whole forest could hear it. He stood behind a tree and watched the orcs by the fire. Huge. In the fire's glow, their shadows on the trees looked like giants. One was gnawing meat off a bone. Another was sharpening an axe. A third was picking his teeth. Nearby was a pen, a palisade of logs. Behind it, quiet sounds. Sobs, moans, whimpering. 40 goblins in the pen, waiting for death. A sound, quiet, like a twig snapping, from the far edge of the camp. One of the orc sentries turned at the sound, stepped into the darkness. Silence. The second sentry waited, called out. No answer. Went to check. Silence. Zara. Grix didn't know how she'd done it, didn't ask afterward. The result was there. No sentries. 3 by the fire, 5 in the tent. Grix raised his hand, lowered it. 10 crossbows clicked. 10 bolts flew into the darkness. A distance of 10 paces. It was impossible to miss, even for a goblin. 3 bolts struck the orc who was devouring meat. Neck, shoulder, side. He wheezed and fell face first into the fire. The one sharpening the axe took 2. Arm, chest. He jumped up and swung the axe. Grix shouted, "Reload!" 5 crossbows clicked again. 2 more bolts struck the orc in the stomach and leg. He fell to one knee. The third orc by the fire took 3 bolts and rolled on the ground, wheezing. Mord was already running, with 10 blades, toward the tent. The flap swung open. An orc poked his head out, sleepy. Mord struck his throat with a blade. Short, precise, just as Grix had taught him. Don't swing wide, don't chop. Stab, in the throat, in the eye, in the groin, where there are no muscles or thick skin. Mord burst into the tent. 4 more followed him. Screams, roars, the crack of tearing fabric. One orc burst out of the tent, unarmed, naked, huge. 3 goblins hung on him. He shook one off. The second clung to his leg. The third struck him in the back with a blade. The orc fell. The goblins piled on top of him. Grix turned away. He looked at the one he'd struck with the axe by the fire. Still alive. Crawling. The whimpering in the pen grew louder. The goblins inside heard everything. Didn't understand. Were afraid. Grix ran up to the pen. The stockade was crude, logs driven into the ground, tied with sinew. Ropes came into play. 5 goblins threw ropes over the logs and pulled. The goblins didn't have enough strength. Grix shouted for everyone to pull. 10 pairs of hands. A log popped out of the ground. Then a second. A hole. Goblins crawled out of it. Skinny, dirty, terrified. Some were wounded from beatings. Some couldn't stand and were crawling. One female goblin was carrying a cub on her back. Grix counted. 38, not 40. 2 were missing. Dead. Had died in the pen. The 38 survivors looked at Grix and his goblins with crossbows and blades. They looked at the dead orcs. 10 dead orcs. 10. One of the freed ones fell to his knees. Then a second. Then another. They fell to their knees before Grix and howled, thinly, pitifully. It wasn't crying. It was something ancient, something from the depths of goblin memory. Acknowledgement, submission, gratitude, all at once. Grix grabbed the nearest one by the shoulder, lifted him up, told him to stand, told him that the goblins of the horde do not kneel before anyone, ever. Silence. 38 pairs of eyes. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. They stood up, slowly, on shaky legs, but they stood. Mord emerged from the tent, covered in blood, not his own. He raised a hand. 5 fingers. 5 orcs in the tent are dead. 10 out of 10. Horde casualties, 0. 1 goblin with a bruised rib from an orc's kick. That's all. Grix said quickly, "Gather weapons, gather food, gather everything we can carry, and leave, now. The main camp is 100 paces away. If anyone notices the silence, if anyone comes to check." The goblins worked, quickly, silently. Fear drove them faster than any order. 4 axes were taken from the dead orcs, 6 knives, 2 leather armor sets that looked like floor-length dresses to the goblins, but the material would make a dozen goblin breastplates. Bags of food, dried meat, bread, real bread. The goblins looked at the bread as if it were a miracle. Most had never tasted bread in their lives. Grix ordered the retreat, Zara in the lead, Mord in the rearguard. 63 goblins in single file through the dark forest, 25 fighters and 38 freed ones, 38 of whom 10 could not walk on their own and were carried on their backs. Slowly. Too slowly. Grix kept track of the time. They had until morning. In the morning, the orcs would notice the pen was empty, that 10 guards were dead, and they would follow the trail. 110 orcs on the trail of 63 goblins. They had to make it to the gorge and get ready. They walked all night. By dawn, they reached the gorge. One Ear met them at the entrance. He saw 38 new goblins. He saw the orcs' weapons. He saw the blood on Mord. His single ear twitched. He asked how many orcs. Mord held up both hands, 10 fingers. One Ear whistled. A high-pitched goblin whistle. Then he looked at Grix. And for the first time, Grix saw something other than distrust on One Ear's face. Grix didn't linger on the moment. He said the orcs were coming, soon, that the gorge needed to be prepared, now. Everyone. Everyone. The freed goblins were fed, quickly. Those who could move were put to work digging. New pits, more, deeper, on all the approaches. Grix positioned archers on the gorge walls. 15 crossbows. Picks had been working non-stop for the past week. Each crossbow was better than the last. The last 3 had bone tips on bolts in a bow made of double-layered ironwood. They had a range of 50 paces and drove a finger's depth into a log. No worse than human ones. Grix had stationed 15 archers on the walls, 7 on each side and 1 at the highest point, the lookout. He'll be the first to see, the first to give the signal. Blades below, in the gorge, beyond the pits. If anyone makes it past the traps and the crossfire, they'll run into a wall of goblins with blades. Small ones, but standing shoulder to shoulder, just as Grix taught. A line, a formation, a wall. By noon, everything was ready. 115 goblins were waiting. 38 of the new ones were too weak for battle. Grix sent them deep into the gorge, with Usha, with the children, far away. If things went badly, Usha would lead them along the southern trail to the caves in the hills. 77 fit for battle. Grix didn't know how many Drakkar would come against them.
Maybe 20. Maybe 50.
Maybe all 110. Zara looked at him. She said quietly that there was something else, that she'd seen someone at the orc camp. Not an orc, not a goblin, a figure in a gray cloak, standing in the shadows by Drakkar's tent. Zara couldn't make out the face, but the figure was tall, taller than an orc, and it smelled strange, not alive, like something old and dry, like stone in a basement. Grix looked at Zara. He asked what the figure was doing. Zara said it was standing there, just standing and looking at the pen with the goblins, for a long time. And then it left, into the forest, silently. Gray. Gray again. The prickling under his skin grew deeper. Grix put it aside. Not the time. The watchman's cry from the wall. They're coming. They were walking along the path. Grix saw them from the gorge wall. Not 110. 30. 36 orcs in leather armor with axes and shields. An orc larger than the rest walked in front,
A scar across his chest. Fangs longer than the others. A necklace of small skulls around his neck. Goblin skulls. Drakkar. Grix recognized him from Zara's description. The leader of the orc horde had come in person. That was both good and bad. Good because 30 isn't 110. Bad because Drakkar had come alone. That meant he was angry. That meant he wouldn't back down. The orcs marched confidently, without hiding, without scouting. Why scout before hunting goblins? They're just goblins, rats, trash. Kick them and move on. 30 orcs against 77 goblins. In open combat, it's a slaughter. 30 seconds and the goblins will be nothing but splatters. But there won't be a battle in the open field. Grix made sure everyone was in position. Archers on the walls, blades behind the pits, stones stacked. Ropes were taut. He went down and stood behind the line of fighters. Not in front, behind, where a commander should stand. Mord stood in the front row, a blade in his right hand, a shield in his left. Not a real shield, a piece of wood covered with orc hide stripped from captured armor. But it was enough for a goblin. It covered him from waist to head. The first orc stepped into the trap zone. He didn't notice. One step, another, a third. He fell through. A roar. The pit was deeper than the first ones they dug against the humans, and the stakes were longer. An orc is heavier than a human. He fell deeper. The stakes pierced both his legs. He screamed so loudly the leaves shook. A second orc rushed toward him. He fell into the neighboring pit. The third stopped. He looked down at his feet. He yelled to the others, "Stop! Pits!" The orcs stopped. They began to scan the ground, carefully. They poked the handles of their axes in front of them. They found pits. They went around them, slowly. Grix waited. He needed them to enter the gorge. To enter the narrow passage where the number of orcs didn't matter because they couldn't stand more than 2 abreast. Drakkar yelled at his men. His voice was like thunder. He drove them forward. The orcs bypassed the pits. They lost 2 in the traps. 28 entered the path leading to the gorge. It was cramped. Trees on either side. The gorge walls ahead narrowed. The orcs marched in pairs, a long column. Grix raised his hand. The lookout at the highest point mimicked the gesture. 15 crossbows took aim. Grix lowered his hand. A volley. 15 bolts struck the column, from 10 paces, from above to the ground. Pick's bone arrowheads pierced the orc's skin. Not all of them went deep. Orcs aren't human. Their skin is thick. Their muscles are like ropes. A bolt that would kill a human only angers an orc. But 3 orcs fell. One with a bolt in his eye. One with a bolt in his throat. one with 2 bolts in his neck. The rest raised their shields. They roared. They charged forward, into the gorge. Grix shouted, "Reload! In stones!" The goblins on the walls began dropping stones, heavy ones. In the narrow passage, the stones fell right on their heads. One orc collapsed with a shattered skull. Another staggered. His shield split. A second volley from the crossbows. 2 more orcs fell. Drakgar roared. Grix heard his voice above all the chaos. The chieftain drove his men forward, through the rocks, through the bolts, forward. There were goblins there. There was the who dared to raise a hand against their masters. 22 orcs broke through the gorge, broke through the rocks and bolts, ran out onto the clearing before the goblin line, and saw the formation. 3 rows of green bodies, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. Small, pitiful, but standing, not running, standing and waiting. The orcs hesitated for a moment. They had never seen anything like this. Goblins don't form ranks. Goblins run, either toward you or away from you, but they don't stand. The moment passed. The orcs struck. The first blow was terrible. An orcish axe crashed down on the shield of a goblin in the front row. The shield shattered. The goblin was thrown back 2 paces, but the second row stood behind him, supporting him with their backs. And the goblin didn't fall. He swayed, but he held his ground, and struck with his blade from below, at the orc's groin, under the leather armor. The orc doubled over. The one to his left struck him in the neck. The one on the right stabbed his knee. 3 goblins, 1 orc. The orc fell. Nearby, another orc sliced the goblin from top to bottom. Grix saw the body fall apart. The first casualty. A name. He had a name. A mark on the gorge wall. A small squiggle. Grix remembered it. The ranks closed. The gap was sealed. The second row thrust out their spears, long sticks with knives tied to the ends. Rough, but sharp. The spears poked out from behind the shields, at faces, at arms, at legs. The orcs recoiled. They were used to goblins running away, that a single blow was enough. But here, 1 blow and a wall stood in their way. And spikes jutted out of the wall, stinging them, and stones rained down from above, and crossbow bolts whistled through the air. A third volley, a fourth. The archers reloaded quickly. Pix had taught them to place a foot on the bow, to pull the string with both hands, to load a bolt, to aim, to release. 4 seconds, not 2 like a human crossbowman, but 4 is enough when there are 15 archers, a volley every 4 seconds. Drakgar broke through his own ranks, huge, enraged, with a double-headed axe. He struck the formation and broke through it. 3 goblins flew away like rags. 1 didn't get up. A second didn't get up. The third got up, his face contorted, and sank his teeth into the orc's leg. Drakgar shook him off with a kick. He stepped forward, straight at Grix. Mord stood in his way. Mord, with a blade and a cracked shield. The largest goblin in the horde, up to Drakgar's waist. Drakgar looked down at him. He smirked. He swung his axe. Mord didn't block. He dove down, into the blow, under his feet, with his blade at the tendon on his ankle. Drakgar roared. His leg buckled. He fell to 1 knee. Mord rolled back, jumped up, struck again, to the side, into the gap between the plates of his armor. The blade sank into his palm. Drakgar swatted it away with the back of his fist. Mord was sent flying 3 paces. He slammed into the gorge wall, slid down. But Drakgar could no longer stand. His leg wouldn't hold him. Blood was gushing from his side. He stood on 1 knee and roared. Goblins closed in around him, 10 of them, with blades and spears. He swung his axe to fend them off. He took 1 down, sliced him from shoulder to waist, took down another, chopped off his arm. But the remaining 8 kept poking and stinging, like wasps, like rats. Like 100 tiny teeth sinking into a carcass that still twitches but is already doomed. Drakgar fell, face down. Not immediately, slowly. Like a tree being chopped down that still stands and then crashes to the ground. He lay in the dust, huge, wounded. The necklace of goblin skulls scattered across the ground. The small yellow skulls rolled between the goblin's legs. The remaining orcs saw their chieftain fall, and they broke. Not immediately. First one backed away, then another. Then they ran. Across the gorge, over rocks and boulders, back, into the forest. Grix did not pursue. Enough. Enough. He stood and counted the casualties. 7 dead goblins, 12 wounded, 3 of them seriously, 1 without an arm, 1 with his chest sliced open, 1 with a broken spine. He won't get up. 7 dead. 7 marks on the wall that now belonged to the dead. Grix approached the bodies. Small. Green blood on the stones. He knew their names. All 7 of them. 3 of his original 12. Those who had run after him into the ravine on the first day. Those who had dug the first pits. Those who had believed first. Mord stood up, staggering. His left arm hung limply, dislocated or broken. Usha was already running toward him with a pouch of herbs. Mord waved her away. He walked over to Drakgar's body. He looked. Then he bent down. He stripped the armor from the orc. Leather shoulder pads with iron plates, huge for a goblin. But Mord put them on. They hung off him like a cloak, ridiculous, but symbolic. Mord turned to the horde. He raised the blade from which blood was dripping, and roared. Not with words, with sound. A pure, animal roar of a victor. The goblins joined in. 70 voices, high-pitched, shrill, but loud. The gorge trembled from the cry. Grix didn't shout. He stood over the bodies of the 7 dead and thought that this was only the beginning, and that the price would rise. That evening, he did something no goblin had done in 300 years. He dug 7 graves. He placed a body in each one. He buried them, and he placed a stone over each grave. On each stone, he scratched a mark. That very one. The personal mark of each of the fallen. Their mark from the gorge's wall. The goblins stood around, in silence. They didn't understand. Dead goblins aren't buried. Dead goblins are left behind. Or eaten if they're really hungry. That's how it's always been. Grix stood before the graves. He looked at the horde. He said that these 7 were not trash, that they had stood their ground, that they had not run, that they had died, but the ranks had held, and that their names would remain on the stones. And every goblin of the horde would know that if he fell in battle, he would not be abandoned. He would be buried. His name would be carved into the stone, and he would be remembered. Silence. Usha stepped forward. She stood before the graves. She looked at the stones with the markings, and she wept. Quietly, soundlessly. Tears streamed down her wrinkled green skin. She turned to the horde and said that for 300 years, goblins had been discarded like trash. That for 300 years, a dead goblin was just a body on the road. That this chieftain was the first to say that a dead goblin has a name. And she doesn't know who he is or where he's from, but she knows where he's leading them. To what they had never had. To dignity. She knelt before the graves, not before Grix, before the dead. And she said she would keep their names, and the names of all who would come after, because that was now her duty, the keeper of names. The goblins looked at her, at the graves, at the marked stones, and something was changing in their eyes, something quiet and slow, like dawn, when the darkness hasn't yet faded but the light is already there. Grix watched this and thought that Artem, the historian who died under a tram on a gray Wednesday, never imagined he would be standing over goblin graves in a foreign world and feel his throat tighten. But his throat was tightening. And that was right.
After Drakgar's death, the forest fell silent. 3 days without a single orc patrol, not a single human sentry. Silence. Grix didn't trust the silence. Silence in war means someone is thinking, and when the enemy thinks, it means they're preparing something worse than a mindless attack. Grix used the lull. The wounded were treated. Usha knew herbs for inflammation, and herbs for pain, and herbs for fever. Mordu's shoulder was set. He walked with his arm in a sling and growled at anyone who asked how he was. 2 days later, he took off the sling. His arm worked. Not fully, but it worked. Goblin bodies are fragile but resilient. They heal faster than human ones. Ushsa said that this was the only gift nature had given to the green folk. Break a goblin, and in a week, he's back on his feet. Grix wasted no time. The 38 freed goblins needed to be integrated into the horde. They were more broken than the rest. An orc pen isn't just a prison. It's a place where you're beaten every day so you remember you're nobody. Some of the freed ones flinched at any sudden noise. Some couldn't meet anyone's gaze. One goblin woman wouldn't let go of her cub and growled at anyone who approached. Grix didn't rush them. He put them to light work, gathering roots, cutting branches, weaving ropes. Work heals. Not right away, but it heals. When your hands are busy, your mind thinks less. And when, in the evening, you eat alongside everyone else and no one beats you for taking a piece of food, the world begins to look different. On the 4th day, Grix gathered the commanders. He laid out a map, a clay tablet on which Zara and he had drawn the surrounding area, the forest, the gorge, the orc camp to the north, the human fort to the west, 3 goblin tribes to the east, hills and caves to the south. Grix poked the orc camp with his stick. He said that Drakgar was dead. His 100 orcs were leaderless. Orcs without a leader fight among themselves for power. A week, maybe 2. Then the strongest will win, and the orcs will be dangerous again. The horde has a window. 2 weeks. Mord asked what the window was for. Grix poked his stick at the 3 goblin tribes to the east. Mouseclaw, Black Clay, White Worm. About 60 goblins in total. If they join us, there will be 175. Mord nodded. The Rat-Tail Chieftain asked what if they didn't want to. Grix said they would want to. After what happened. Rumors. Grix already understood how rumors worked in the goblin world. Fast. Goblin vagabonds. Loners who didn't belong to any tribe. They scurried through the forest like rats. They stole. They eavesdropped. And they spread the news. By this time, every goblin tribe within a day's journey knew that someone had killed people. Killed orcs. Killed Drakgar himself. That there was a ravine where goblins ate every day and no one beat them. That there was a chieftain who buried the dead with their names. To a goblin raised in filth and beatings, it sounded like a fairy tale. Impossible. Insane. But alluring. Grix sent delegations. Not an army, not a threat. Trios. One with a crossbow slung over his shoulder, one with a captured orcish axe, one with a sack of food. Weapons and food. 2 arguments a goblin understands without translation. 3 trios went to 3 tribes, with the same message. The horde accepts everyone. Food every day. Weapons. Protection. One condition. You are no longer Mouseclaw, nor Black Clay, nor White Worm. You are the horde. 1 tribe. 1 chieftain. The result exceeded expectations. Mouseclaw came in full force. 23 goblins. Their chieftain had died of illness a week ago, and the tribe was falling apart. They were looking for a place to settle. The horde turned out to be the answer. Black Clay haggled. Their chieftain, an old, cunning, one-eyed goblin, wanted special terms. More food for herself, personally. Grix said no. Equal shares, like everyone else. The chieftain left. She returned 2 days later, without the 3 goblins who had left with her. They stayed in the forest. They didn't want to submit to the horde. Their right. Grix didn't go looking for them. A goblin brought by force is worse than a useless one. He's dangerous. The White Worm turned out to be more complicated. a nomadic tribe, 27 members. Their leader, a young, strong goblin named Shark, didn't want to lose power. He came to the gorge himself, with 5 fighters. He looked at the camp, at the traps, at the crossbows, at the formation that trained every morning by the walls. He looked at the graves with the namestones. He looked at the graves for a long time. Then he turned to Grix and said he would come. But he wanted to be in command. Not to be under someone else's wing, but to have his own. Grix looked at him. Young, strong, ambitious. He reminded him of the young commanders from the Mongol Empire, the ones Temujin had placed in command of thousands, not by birth, by ability. Grix said fine. He said he was forming a 4th unit, a reconnaissance squad, fast, mobile, the 20 best runners. Shark would command, under Grix's overall command. Shark narrowed his eyes, thought it over, nodded. By the end of the 3rd week after the rebirth, the horde numbered 178 goblins. The gorge had become cramped. Too many bodies for such a narrow space. The stench, the crush. Fights over a spot by the fire. 3 fights in 2 days. Mord broke up one with his fist. The other 2 ended in bites and torn shreds of skin. Grix understood. You can't keep nearly 200 goblins in a crevice between the rocks. We need space. We need to build. To really build. He remembered the caves in the south. The very ones where Zara had found the shard with ancient writing. Large, deep, in the hills, far from orcs and humans, protected by nature itself. Grix took 20 goblins and Zara and headed south. Half a day's journey through a dense forest. Then the forest ended and the hills began. Rocky, overgrown with tough brush, streams between the rocks, good water, clean. Zara led them to a cave. The entrance was narrow, overgrown, invisible unless you knew it was there. Grix squeezed inside. Darkness, the smell of stone and water. Cold. Torches made from tarred branches lit up the walls. Grix froze. The walls were smooth. Not naturally smooth. Worked. Someone had once chiseled this stone, with tools. The floor was level. The ceiling was high. 3 goblins couldn't reach each other. The cave stretched deep into the darkness. Grix walked on. The torch trembled in his hand. A corridor. Wide. Walls with niches. The niches were empty, but the niches were cut evenly, square, identical. Shelves. Something had once stood here. Books. Vessels. Figures. Something that had been taken or destroyed a very long time ago. The corridor led to a hall. Huge. The torch didn't reach the far wall. Grix stopped in the center. He raised the torch higher. There were drawings on the walls. No, not drawings. Carvings. Bas reliefs. Figures in stone. Goblins. Grix stepped closer. Yes, goblins. But not the hunched, downtrodden creatures he knew. These stood upright, tall, in armor, with weapons, with crowns on their heads. Goblin kings. A story was carved into the walls of the hall. Grix walked along the wall and read it like a comic book. Scene 1. Goblins are building a city. Stone walls, towers, bridges. Scene 2. Goblins are trading with other races. Taller figures with long ears. Elves. Larger figures with fangs. Orcs. All standing as equals. Scene 3. The Goblin Army. Formation. Ranks. Banners. An army that looked like a real force. Not trash. Not cannon fodder. A force. Scene 4. Grix stopped. A figure. Tall. In a cloak. Standing before the Goblin King. No face. Just a silhouette. And lines radiate from the silhouette. Cracks. They spread across the entire wall. From the cloaked figure, the cracks extend toward the city, toward the army, toward the goblins. And behind the cracks, everything collapses. The city crumbles. The army scatters. The goblins fall to their knees. The final scene. The figure in the cloak stands alone. Ruins all around. And small, hunched figures scatter in different directions. Goblins. The very same ones. Beaten down. Shattered. Rubble. Usha stood nearby.
She looked at the wall. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She said quietly that the songs hadn't lied, that there had been a people, a real people,
with cities and an army and a written language. And someone destroyed all of that. Someone gray. Grix looked at the figure in the cloak on the wall, the gray priest. He didn't know that name yet, but he knew that this creature was real, and that 1,000 years ago it had done to the goblins what no war could have done. It didn't kill them. It erased their memory, their history, their pride. It turned a people into trash, not with a sword, but with oblivion. And now Grix stood amid the ruins of what had been stolen, and he understood that he wasn't building a goblin empire from scratch. He was reviving what had been. He was returning what had been stolen. Grix turned to his goblins, 20 pairs of eyes in the light of the torches, round, yellow, frightened by the underground darkness. He told them this was their home, not a ravine, not a burrow in the ground. This, the caves their ancestors had carved into the stone, the city that existed before everything collapsed. They had returned home. The goblins were silent. They didn't understand everything, but they saw the walls. They saw the bas-reliefs. They saw goblins wearing crowns. They saw that long ago their own race had not been rats, but kings. And something stirred within them, small, hot, something that had never been there before. Not hope. Rage. The quiet rage of one who has discovered that something has been stolen from him. Grix saw it in their eyes and realized he had found the most powerful weapon of all, more powerful than crossbows and traps and military formations. The truth. Tell a goblin that he's trash, and he'll believe it because he's heard it for 300 years. Tell a goblin that he was a king and show him the proof on the wall, and he'll want to be king again. Not for Grix, for himself. In 2 days the horde had moved, from the gorge to the caves. It was a long journey. Nearly 200 goblins stretched through the forest in a single file, with weapons, with supplies, with children on their backs, slowly, carefully. Zara and Shark, along with the scouts, walked ahead and on the flanks, covering them, clearing the path. Not a single encounter with the enemy. They were lucky. Or perhaps the enemies were busy with their own affairs. The caves took in the horde. There was plenty of space. The main hall for gatherings, side corridors for living quarters, storage niches, a stream inside the mountain for water. Grix was in charge of distribution. Mord and his fighters were at the main entrance. Families with children were further inside. Pix's workshop was in a side cave with good ventilation for the forge. Usha was in a niche by the stream, preparing medicines. He was building. Not a city yet, a base. A place that could be defended and from which they could grow. On the evening of their first day in the caves, Grix stood before a wall of bas-reliefs, a torch in his hand. Shadows danced across the stone faces of the goblin kings. Usha stood beside him, silently. Then she said she could feel them, those who lived here 1,000 years ago, that the stone remembers. Grix didn't believe in mysticism. Artem was a scientist, a materialist. But standing in an ancient goblin cave, in the body of a goblin, in a world where there is magic and races and a creature that feeds on war, he allowed for the possibility that stone could remember. He touched the wall. The stone was cold, smooth. He could feel the grooves of the carvings under his fingers. 1,000 years ago, there was a civilization here. The gray priest destroyed it, wiped it out, like with an eraser, and forced the goblins to forget that they were ever anyone. Grix stood in this cave and made a vow to himself, quietly, without witnesses, without fanfare. He would bring it back. Everything. Not for himself, for those 178 green bodies now settling into the corridors and niches. For those who haven't come yet but will. For every goblin cub born who won't know what a pin is, or beatings, or death without a name. He would bring it back. The stone remembers, and the goblins will remember. A month has passed since the day Artem opened his eyes in a green body. A month. Grix stood at the entrance to the caves and looked at the hills. Morning light fell on the rocky slopes. Down in the valley between the hills, figures were moving. Small, green. His goblins. 211. 33 more had arrived over the past week. Small groups, vagabonds, fragments of shattered tribes, lonesomes who'd heard the rumors and come to check it out. Some came and went, didn't believe it, or didn't want to submit. Most stayed, because they were fed here, because they weren't beaten here, because goblin kings were carved into the cave walls, and it changed something inside everyone who saw them. Grix looked out at the valley and saw not 211 goblins. He saw a city, still invisible, still non-existent, but already drawn on the clay map in his mind. He began to build. Not caves. Outside. Between the hills. A place where two slopes met, forming a natural wall to the north and west. The open sides were south and east. A wall was needed there. A real one. A stone one. Grix looked at the stones around him. The hills were full of stones. Loose. Lying there. Just pick them up and put them down. No quarry needed. No tools for cutting needed. Hands were needed. Lots of hands. Goblin hands. He announced the construction project at the morning meeting. He said the Horde was building a wall. Everyone not busy hunting or on patrol would haul stones. Every day. The goblins grumbled. They'd never built anything. Didn't know how. Stone is heavy. The work is mindless. Why? Grix explained. Without a wall, they're exposed. Any enemy can come whenever they want. A wall is life. A wall is sleep without fear. A wall is children playing instead of hiding. The argument about the children worked. The female goblins, who until now had been sleeping while hugging their young and flinching at every sound, were the first to go carry stones. The rest followed suit, herd instinct. They worked slowly. One goblin carries a stone the size of a head. 2 goblins carry a larger stone. 4 drag a stone the size of a barrel on a sled. Grix marked out the wall's line. He showed where to place them, how to stack them. Large stones at the bottom, medium ones on top. Fill the gaps with small stones and clay. The principle of dry masonry. No mortar. Not an eternal wall, but sufficient. If it's as tall as a goblin and 2 stones thick, it will withstand an infantry assault. Not a siege, but a direct attack, yes. At the same time, Grix was working on something else. Writing. The 12 pictograms he created in the gorge were a start, but not a system. Pictograms depict objects, a goblin, food, an enemy. They cannot depict an action. They cannot depict time. They cannot record a command more complex than 3 symbols in a row. The next step is needed. A syllabic script. Each symbol represents a sound, not a letter, a syllable. Simpler than an alphabet, more complex than pictures. Japanese kana worked that way. Sumerian cuneiform began that way. Grix sat in the cave in the evenings and devised symbols. The goblin language is crude, short, fewer sounds in it than in human languages, about 40 syllables. 40 symbols that need to be invented and that every goblin must learn. Over 12 evenings he created 42 symbols. Simple, angular, easy to scratch into stone or clay, easy to remember. Each symbol is a single movement, a single stroke or one squiggle. He began teaching. 5 symbols a day. He gathered a group of 10 goblins. He showed them a symbol. He pronounced the sound. He made them repeat it. Scratch it out. Over and over. The first 3 days were torture. The goblins didn't understand why. Sounds are just sounds. The mouth makes them for free. Why scratch a stone to show a sound? Grix explained with an example. He called 2 of them. He put one on the hill, the other in the cave. He told the first to pass the order to the second. Go to the stream and bring water. The first shouted the order. The second didn't hear. Too far away. Then Grix gave the first man a clay tablet with carved symbols. Go to the stream, bring water. The first man took the tablet to the second. The second looked at it, read it, slowly, syllable by syllable. He went to the stream. He brought back water. Grix turned to the others. He said that a shout carries 100 paces. A tablet carries as far as you want. A chieftain can sit in a cave and command 100 goblins at the other end of the valley, without shouting, without running, just with a tablet. The goblins were silent. Then one said, "It was magic." Grix shook his head. He said it was better than magic. The elves have magic, and they still haven't united. Humans have letters, and they've built kingdoms. Now the goblins will have letters, and they'll build more than a kingdom. Within a week, 20 goblins could read and write. Crookedly, slowly, with mistakes, but they could. Grix appointed them as teachers. Each teaches 5. Those 5 teach 5 more. A pyramid. In a month, the entire horde will be literate. Not at the level of human scholars, at a level sufficient to read an order, to write a report, to sign their names. The first thing Grix ordered them to write down were names, all 211 of them, on a large flat stone in the center of the main hall. Each name on a new line. A list, a census, the first document of the goblin horde. Usha stood before the stone and ran her finger over the names. She whispered each one. The keeper of names now kept them not in her memory, but in stone. Grix was busy with other things as well. Pix had received assistance. 5 young goblins with nimble hands. Grix called them the workshop. Pix became the master craftsman. In a month, the workshop produced 32 crossbows. The latest models were serious weapons. A double bow made of ironwood, bone bolt tips, a sighting bar made of bone along the stock. Pix had come up with the sighting bar himself. Grix hadn't given him any hints. The goblin's engineering genius worked on its own. It produced results Grix hadn't expected. Besides crossbows, the workshop made shields, wooden frames covered with a double layer of leather, lightweight, tailored to a goblin's height. Covering the body from knee to head, they wouldn't withstand a blow from an orc's axe, but they'd deflect an arrow, and a stone, and the first strike of a sword. They moved the forge into the cave, bigger, better, with a double bellows. 2 goblins took turns blowing. The heat was higher. The steel glowed red hot. Mord forged blades, 2 a day, short, fitted to a goblin's hand. Better each time. The 20th blade no longer looked ugly. It looked like a weapon, rough but functional. The 30th was almost beautiful, a smooth blade, sharpened on both sides, a leather-wrapped hilt. Mord looked at his work, and something changed in his face. He was a fighter, a killer, the horde's fist. But when he forged and saw a blade being born from a piece of steel, an expression appeared in his eyes that Grix had never seen in battle. Calm. Creating turned out to be more interesting than destroying, even for Mord. 1 month, 211 goblins, 32 crossbows, 47 blades, 60 shields, a stone wall as tall as a goblin and 200 paces long, a writing system of 42 characters, 20 literate teachers, a census of names carved in stone, Horn, the workshop, the valley between the hills that Grix had already begun to call Rottenroot in his mind, in memory of the first tribe, of those 12 from the ravine with whom it all began. He stood on the hill and looked down. The goblins were working, hauling stones, drilling in formation, learning to shoot crossbows, learning to read and write. Children played by the stream and, for the first time, didn't hide at every rustle. A goblin woman with a cub in her arms, the very one from the pen who had let him go. He hobbled across the grass on his thin green legs, poking at stones and beetles with his finger. Grix watched this and thought that this was what it was all for this little one, who for the first time in his life was walking on the grass instead of sitting in a pen. For this, it was worth building walls and forging swords and teaching the goblins the alphabet. Zara appeared beside him, quietly, as always. She said there was news. Bad news. The orcs had chosen a new chieftain. Faster than Grix had expected. A week instead of 2. The new chieftain wasn't from the Drakgar clan, an outsider, from the distant eastern horde. His name was Gorak.
Zara said he was smarter than Drakgar. Not just stronger than anyone else, but he actually thinks. He won't rush the caves with 30 orcs. He'll gather his forces. He'll unite the surrounding orcs. And he'll come with hundreds. And there's one more piece of news. Worse. The human baron from the fort sent a messenger east, to the capital of the human kingdom. Zara didn't intercept the messenger, but she caught wind of him. Human merchants in the border village said the baron is asking for reinforcements. The reason? Goblins. Organized goblins. Armed goblins. The baron doesn't know the details, but he knows something has changed. That a squad of 8 soldiers has gone missing. That the orc chieftain has been killed and the orcs are on edge. That something is brewing in the forest is brewing. And the baron is smart enough to be afraid. Grix listened and calculated. Orcs to the north, humans to the west. Both know something is wrong. Both are preparing. He might have 2 months. Maybe 3. Then they'll come. Grix looked at the wall that was waist-high to a goblin and should be full height. For 32 for which 100 are needed. 211 goblins for which 1,000 are needed. Not enough. Not enough time. Not enough of anything. But Artem knew from history that there is never enough time. Temujin united the steppe with a knife to his throat. Rome grew surrounded by enemies. Israel built a state in the midst of war. Those who rise from the bottom have no luxury to wait. They build and fight at the same time, or they die. Grix turned to Zara. He said they needed more goblins, many more, and faster. Zara nodded. She said she knew where. To the north, beyond the orc camp. There were large goblin settlements there, hundreds of them, under orc control. Slaves. But if they found out that Drakgar was dead and that there was a place where goblins weren't beaten, they would flee. Grix shook his head. They won't run. A slave doesn't run just because he heard a nice story. A slave runs when he sees that others are already free and alive. We don't need rumors. We need proof. Living, walking proof. He turned to the horde, to the 211 goblins who were building a wall and learning to read and carrying weapons and ate every day, and he said quietly, soon. Grix came up with a plan in a single night. Simple, like all good plans, and insane, like everything he'd done since his rebirth. In the morning, he gathered the commanders. He spread out a map. He pointed to the orc camp in the north. He said that Gorak was gathering orcs. In a month or two, he'd have 300 fighters, against 211 goblins, of whom 130 are combat-ready. He pointed to the human fort in the west. The Baron is waiting for reinforcements. When he gets them, he'll field 200 soldiers, maybe more. 2 enemies, from 2 sides. If they strike at the same time, the horde won't hold out, not even in the caves, not even with the traps. Mord asked what to do. Grix said we need to make sure they don't strike at the same time, and for that, we need them to strike each other. Silence. Mord tilted his head. The rat-tailed chieftain narrowed his eyes. Shark leaned forward. Zara didn't move, but her eyes flashed. Grix explained. The human fears orcs. Orcs despise humans. Both hate goblins, but both hate each other as well. 300 years of the eternal war. 300 years of slaughter between the races. Distrust is ingrained in their bones. We need a push, a small one, a precise one, so that the orcs strike the humans before both sides reach the goblins. Grix drew an arrow on the map, from the orc camp to the human fort. He said that Zara and Shark, along with the scouts, would carry out the operation. 2 phases. Phase 1. Zara will sneak up to the human fort, not inside, just to the walls, at night, and she'll leave an orcish weapon, Drakgar's axe, a knife with an orcish brand, on the trail to the fort, where the human patrol will find it in the morning. She'll trample footprints nearby, heavy ones, orcish, big feet, deep prints. The humans will find the footprints and the weapon and decide that the orcs are a reconnaissance mission before the attack. The Baron will be frightened. Phase 2. Shark, with 10 fighters, will go to the orc camp.
at night, not to attack, to provoke. They will shoot flaming arrows at the tents, human arrows, trophied bolts from a human crossbow, with human fletching, with human arrowheads. The orcs will find the bolts. They'll see the human fletching. They'll decide that the humans attacked first. Gorak will respond, because an orc always responds to a blow. It's in their blood. It's in their culture. An orc who doesn't avenge an attack isn't a chieftain. 2 blows. 2 provocations. 2 enemies who throw themselves at each other instead of heading toward the goblins. Mord listened. He grunted. Then he slowly bared his teeth, wide, toothy, and said that a chieftain doesn't fight. A chieftain fights with others' hands. Grix didn't smile. He said that while the orcs and humans are busy with each other, the horde will be doing something else. Growing. Those goblin slaves in the north, beyond the orc camp. When Gorak leads the orcs south toward the human fort, the camp will be left nearly empty. At that moment, the horde will take the slaves. All of them, quietly, quickly. While the masters are fighting among themselves, their livestock will escape. Shark whistled. He said it was complicated, too many moving parts. If even one provocation fails, the plan falls apart. Grix nodded. He said yes, complicated. But they had no choice. In open battle against orcs and humans at the same time, the horde would perish. Cunning is the only weapon of the weak. He knew that from Sun Tzu. War is the way of deception. They prepared for 3 days. Zara left first, alone, with an orcish axe on her back and a sack of orcish belongings. Grix watched as she disappeared into the forest and thought that if anything happened to her, he would lose the horde's eyes. No one is irreplaceable, but Zara was close to being irreplaceable. On the 2nd day, Shark left, with 10 scouts. Each had a crossbow and a bundle of arrows wrapped in tarred cloth. Human arrowheads, human feathers. Grix personally inspected every arrow, not a single goblin detail. The orcs must see a human trail and nothing more. Day 3. Waiting. The hardest part. Grix sat in the cave and sketched. Plans, schemes, options. If the first phase works but not the second. If the second works but not the first. If both fail. A retreat plan for every scenario. Evacuation routes, assembly points. Artem was a strategist in games. There he could restart. Here, there is no restart. Every decision is final. Every mistake costs lives. Little green lives that have only just begun to realize they are worth something. On the 4th night, a goblin from the patrol ran in, gasping for breath. A glow in the north, a big one, orange. A fire in the orc camp. Shark had done his job. In the morning, Zara arrived, unharmed, quiet. She said that the human patrol had found orc weapons and tracks. The Baron raised the garrison on alert. He doubled the patrols, sent a second messenger to the capital. The fort was on high alert. People are waiting for an orc attack. By noon, Zara climbed the hill and looked north. Smoke. Heavy black smoke rose above the forest. The orcs weren't just burning. They were enraged. Gorak found human bolts in the burned-out tents. 3 orcs were burned. 1 died. For an orc, that is a blood debt. Gorak gathered the horde and marched southwest, toward the human fort. 100 orcs, in battle gear, with howls and the thunder of drums. Shark returned in the evening. No casualties. All 10 are safe. He said the orcs passed them an hour ago. A column. Vicious. Fast. Heading for the fort. The orc camp is almost empty. 20 orc guards, the rest left with Gorak, and goblin herds, large ones. Zara spoke of hundreds. Shark confirmed it. He counted no fewer than 300 goblins in the herds, maybe 400. 300. 400.
Grix's breath caught in his throat. If we take these goblins, the horde will triple in size. Over 500, maybe 600. This is no longer a tribe. This is a force. Grix ordered the sortie. Immediately. 60 of the best fighters, with crossbows and blades. Mord at the head of the strike force.
Shark leads them along the trail past the patrols, Zara in front, the rest in the caves under the command of Chief Rattail and One Ear. If anything goes wrong, they'll lead the horde south, deep into the hills, where no one will find them. They traveled at night, quickly. Goblins could see better than humans in the dark. Not as well as elves, but well enough. Along the trails Zara knew, avoiding the main paths, through windfalls and ravines. A 6-hour march. By dawn, they reached the orc camp. The camp was half empty, just as Shark had said. 20 orcs. Half were asleep. The other half wandered around the camp lazily and without fear. Why be afraid?
Gorak had gone off to ravage the humans. Business as usual. The pens stood at the edge of the camp, large ones, 4 fences made of logs, dozens of goblins in each. Grix watched and counted, a little over 300. Skinny, dirty, many wounded. Children clung to their mothers. Old people sat motionless in the corners. Some would never get up again. The scene was familiar. The pen at Drakar's was only 10 times larger. Grix positioned the archers, 20 crossbows in a semicircle, 10 paces to the nearest orc. Mord, with 40 blades, waited behind the trees. Grix gave the signal. The first volley took down 4. The orcs didn't have time to realize what was happening. The second volley took down 3 more. The remaining 13 grabbed their weapons. They roared. They charged the archers. Mord struck from the side, 40 goblins with blades, in formation, shoulder to shoulder, just like in training, a wall of green shields. Spears poking out from behind the shields. The orcs crashed into the formation and got bogged down, like flies in tar, 1 against 5. Axes chopped at the shields, but behind the shields stood goblins, and behind them, more goblins, and spears poked out from behind them all, in the groin, in the eyes, in the armpits, where it hurts and where there is no armor. 4 minutes. 20 orcs lay on the ground. Horde casualties? 2 dead, 6 wounded. 2 dead. Grix remembered the names, the marks on the wall. He would bury them. Later. Now the pens. The goblins were breaking down the fences. Logs cracked and fell. Bodies poured out of the pens. Hundreds. Squinting in the light, staggering, falling. Some couldn't walk. They were carried. Chaos, screams, cries, howls. Grix stood in the center and bellowed, in Goblin, short, sharp. "Let's go, now, follow me. The living follow me. The dead stay behind. Choose." Not everyone went. Some sat on the ground, rocking back and forth, broken, for good. Too long in the pen. Too many beatings, the body free, but the head still in a cage. Grix couldn't wait. Gorak could return at any moment. If the clash with the humans was brief, if the Baron paid a ransom or surrendered the fort right away, if the orcs turned around and went back. 312 goblins followed Grix. The rest stayed behind. Grix remembered this. He remembered the faces of those who sat and rocked. He couldn't help everyone, not now. He would return. When he was stronger. The return journey was a nightmare. 312 exhausted goblins could barely... The children cried, the wounded moaned, the old ones fell. 60 of Grix's fighters carried the wounded, nudged those lagging behind, and dragged those who could not walk. 12 hours. 12 hours through the forest and hills, with stops, with losses. 7 died along the way, from their wounds, from exhaustion, from their bodies simply giving out after months in the pen. When the hills and the entrance to the Grix caves finally came into view, Grix could barely stand on his feet. A goblin's body is frail. 12 hours of marching is the limit for him. Rattail's chieftain met them at the entrance. He saw the column. Over 300 goblins. His jaw dropped. One Ear ran out after him. He stopped. He counted. He stopped counting. Too many. Grix ordered them to be fed. All of them. Now. The entire supply if necessary. We'll hunt more tomorrow. Feed them today. And treat them. Usha was already running, with a sack of herbs and clay bowls. Behind her were a dozen assistants she'd trained over the past month.
They were sorting the wounded, the seriously injured into the cave, the lightly injured to the stream, the children to the nursing goblin women, who in the horde already knew how to treat other people's young as their own. In the evening, Grix counted. The horde before the raid, 211, minus 2 killed, plus 312 freed, minus 7 who died on the way, 514. 514 goblins. 500. Grix sat in the cave and stared at the numbers scratched into the clay. 500. A month ago, he was alone, shivering in a foreign body at the bottom of a ravine. Now, 500. He bowed his head. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the fact that the burden had become 2.5 times heavier overnight. 500 mouths, 500 bodies that needed to be fed and healed and taught and armed and protected. 500 lives on his shoulders, on small, skinny, green shoulders that held not a single ounce of magic, only the memory of a dead historian from another world. 2 weeks after the big raid, a month and a half since his rebirth, Grix hadn't slept properly a single night. Over 500 goblins isn't 200. It's a different scale, different problems. Food, the main problem. Snares and hunting barely fed 200. 500 won't be fed. Grix introduced agriculture, a word that didn't exist in the goblin language. He invented a new one, literally. He took 2 syllables from existing words and stuck them together. Foodland. It sounded crude. It worked perfectly. They cleared the valley between the hills. They uprooted the stumps. They dug up the earth with sticks and sharp stones. No plows, no shovels, no hoes. 100 goblins on all fours dug at the earth with their hands and sticks. Slowly, dully, but effectively. When you have 100 pairs of hands, you don't need tools. You are the tool. Grix didn't know anything about agriculture. Artem was a historian, not a farmer. But he knew the principles. He knew that root vegetables grow faster than grains. He knew that legumes enrich the soil. He knew that watering is more important than fertilizer. They diverted a stream from the cave into a ditch. They ran the ditch along the field. Primitive irrigation. Stones and clay and sticks. Oosh knew edible plants. A wild root resembling a turnip. Bitter, but nutritious. A berry that grew on bushes along the streams. Mushrooms that could be grown in dark caves on damp wood. Grix assigned a dozen goblins to the mushroom farm. The cave. Darkness. Wet logs. In 2 weeks, the first harvest. Small, but ours. Grown. Not caught or found. Grown. The goblins looked at the mushrooms growing from the logs and couldn't believe their eyes. Food that appears on its own. No hunting, no risk. It just grows. Grix said this is only the beginning, that in 3 months the fields will yield root vegetables, that in 6 months the horde will feed itself. No hunting, no gathering, no dependence on the forest. Free, truly free. Because hunger is the most reliable chain, and there is only one way to break it. To learn to feed oneself. Along with the food, Grix was solving a second problem. People. The new 500 were not like the first 200. The first 200 had gone through a month of training. They knew the drill. They knew discipline. They were used to the routine. The new ones had been slaves just yesterday. Broken, intimidated. Many didn't believe freedom was real. They expected a catch. They expected to be beaten again, herded back into a pen, thrown in front of a foreign army like meat. Grix didn't pressure them. He didn't rush them. He placed the new recruits next to the veterans. The veterans showed them how to stand in formation, how to hold a crossbow, how to read signals, how to divide food equally without fighting. Mentorship, a system used by every successful army from Rome to Prussia. An old soldier teaches a young one, not an officer, not a leader, an equal. Just as green, just as small. Only now he knew it worked. Slowly, but it worked. A week later, the new recruits were standing in formation. Crooked, but they were standing. After 2 weeks, they were shooting crossbows. Missing, but they were shooting. Picks worked without sleep. The workshop had grown to 20 goblins. Crossbows were rolling off the line. 3 a day.
Pix had standardized production, a word that Grix had spent half an hour explaining to him. Every part identical, every bow of the same length, every stock was the same width, so that any bolt would fit any crossbow, so that a broken part could be replaced with one from any other. Interchangeability, a principle that people on Earth had discovered in the 18th century. The goblins on Valandor discovered it within the first month and a half of the Horde's existence. Pix grasped the idea instantly. His engineering mind seized the concept and ran with it further than Grix had expected. He created templates, wooden molds from which parts were carved. Any goblin with a knife could carve a crossbow stock using the template. Not a master craftsman. Anyone. Mass production. In a cave. On the fly, but mass production. By the end of the second week, the Horde had 90 crossbows and 120 blades. Grix introduced a new army structure. Not 3 wings, 5 companies, 100 goblins in each. Each company is led by a centurion. 100 is divided into tens. Each 10 is led by a decurion. The decimal system, like the Mongols, like the Romans. It worked for thousands of years on Earth. It will work here too. Mord became the first centurion. Rat-tail's chieftain the second. One-eared the third. Shark was the fourth. Zara commanded the 500. Grix thought long and hard about this. Zara is not a commander. Zara is a scout, a shadow. But she needs status, and she needs people. The 500 became special. Reconnaissance, sabotage, covert operations. The best runners, the best at hiding. Those who see in the dark and move silently. Goblin Special Forces. Zara accepted command without a word. She nodded and went to train her men. 3 days later, the 500 could move through the forest without leaving a single trace. Grix wasn't surprised. Goblins are naturally quiet and inconspicuous. For 300 years they had hidden to survive. Now Grix was turning the instinct of a prey into the skill of a predator. Construction did not stop. The wall grew. To the height of a goblin, then higher. Double-layered, with embrasures for crossbowmen, with platforms for archers on top. Grix designed from memory. The castle walls he'd seen in textbooks and museums, simplified, scaled down, to goblin size, but functional. A gate made of heavy logs, a moat in front of the wall, shallow but with stakes at the bottom. Beyond the wall, a square, the center of the future city. Grix uttered the word city at the morning assembly. 500 goblins were silent. City? Goblins don't have cities. Goblins have burrows, pits, holes in the ground. City is a human word, an elven word, an orcish word, not a goblin word. Grix said that now it's a goblin word too. He said this place is called Rotten Root, and that it's the first city of the goblin people in 1,000 years. Usa stepped forward. She stood next to Grix. She turned to the Horde. She said that history is carved into the walls of the caves, that 1,000 years ago goblins built cities, that they had walls and towers and kings, that someone gray stole it, and that now the chieftain is returning what was stolen, stone by stone. The goblins listened, silently. Many of the newcomers didn't believe it, too broken, too used to the idea that a goblin is filth. But some of the newcomers looked at the wall that was already standing, at the crossbows in their hands, at the literate goblins reading the inscriptions on the clay tablets, at the field already turning green with the first sprouts, and something stirred within them, slowly, painfully, like a bone healing after a fracture. Painful, but right. In the third week after the raid, Grushak arrived. Grix knew about him. Zara had reported it. Grushak was the chieftain of the largest goblin tribe in the region, over 400 members, a powerful tribe. By goblin standards, almost a state. Grushak had ruled for 20 years. Old, cunning, cruel. He ruled the tribe with an iron fist and fear. A traditional goblin chieftain. Beat the weak, bow to the strong, take what you can, run when you can't. That's how they lived for 300 years. That's how it worked. Grushak's tribe survived. It didn't prosper. It survived. Grushak arrived with 20 fighters, armed, axes and clubs. He stood before the gates of Rotten Root. He looked at the wall, at the battlements. at the archers on the wall, at the goblins lined up behind the gates. His face showed nothing. 20 years in power had taught him not to show emotion. Grix came out to meet him, small, skinny, unarmed. Mord was beside him, and Zara in the shadows by the wall.
Grushek was large, very large for a goblin, almost as tall as an orc. Scars on his face and hands, his right fang was broken. The left one jutted out like a dagger. He looked down at Grix for a long time, with the expression an old predator uses when looking at a young one, appraisingly. Then he spoke. His voice was low, hoarse. He said he'd heard about Grix, that he'd heard about the wall and the crossbows and the letters and the graves with names. He said it was all interesting, but stupid, because walls break, crossbows break, letters don't stop swords, and graves only prove that goblins die, just like always. Grix listened. He didn't interrupt. Grushek continued. He said that goblins are goblins, that for 300 years they've been trash, and that one upstart with foreign ideas won't change what's ingrained in their bones, that Grix is playing at being a chieftain, and that the game will end when the real enemies come, people with siege engines, or orcs by the thousands, or elves with magic, and then the wall and the letters and the crossbows won't help, and the goblins will run away again, just like they always have. Grix listened to the end. He nodded. He said that Grushek was right, that walls break, that crossbows break, that walls and crossbows alone won't save them. That's why he needs more than just walls. He needs numbers. 500 isn't enough. 1,000 isn't enough. He needs thousands, tens of thousands. And that is why he is inviting Grushek. Not to submit, to stand alongside him. Grushek's 400 fighters and the Horde's 500 make 900. 900 disciplined, armed goblins. That is no longer a tribe or a gang. That is an army. Grushek bared his teeth. He said he had no intention of submitting to a petty upstart, that his tribe is his, and he'd rather die than give up power. Grish said he wasn't asking for power. He was asking for an alliance. Grushek is the leader of his tribe. Grish is the leader of the Horde. Together they're a council, 2 voices. Grushek was silent. He thought it over. Then he shook his head. He said no. He said he'd come to look. He looked. Impressed. But no. His tribe had survived 20 years under his leadership, without walls, without letters, without fancy words. It had survived and would continue to survive. He turned and left. 20 fighters followed him. Grix watched them go. Mord approached, asked if they should catch up. Grix shook his head. No, not by force. Never by force. Grushek is no enemy. Grushek is an old goblin who doesn't believe it's possible to live any other way, because he's never seen it any other way. He will see. When rotten root grows, when the walls get taller, when the fields yield a harvest, when children learn to read instead of hiding in burrows, Grushek will see and come, on his own. Because his own goblins will see Rottenroot and ask why they don't have the same. And Grushek will either give them the same, or lose them. That's how history works. Grix knew. He'd read about it 1,000 times. A people who see that their neighbor lives better either change or lose people. There is no third option. Grix turned toward the wall, toward his city, toward the 500 goblins who were building and learning and living. Not just surviving, living, for the first time. Time. He needs time. A month. 2. So the walls become stronger. So there are 200. So that Pix could finish what he'd been working on for the past week and hadn't told anyone about except Grix. A new crossbow. A big one. Not handheld, stationary, on a stand, with a crank for tensioning, with a bolt as long as a goblin's arm. A ballista. A small, ugly goblin ballista, which, according to Pix's calculations, would pierce an orc shield at 50 paces. Time. Grix prayed to gods he didn't know and didn't believe in. Give me time. 2 months. and I will build what this world doesn't expect to see. Gorak has returned. Zara brought the news at dawn. Quiet, quick, eyes sharp. She said the orc horde is heading south. Not 100 orcs, 200. Gorak didn't just fight the humans. He won. He destroyed the fort. He killed the Baron. He seized weapons and supplies. And on the way back, he gathered 4 more small orc clans. He brought them under his command. 200 orcs, battle-hardened, vicious, armed with human weapons on top of their own. Gorak returned to his camp. He found the guards dead. Empty pens, traces of hundreds of goblin feet leading south, toward the hills. Zara said that Gorak stood before the empty pens and said nothing. He didn't roar, he didn't pound the ground with his fists. He was silent, and that was scarier than a roar, because a thinking orc is more dangerous than a raging one. He sent out scouts. 3. Zara intercepted 1. 2 got away. So Gorak knows the direction. He knows about the hills. In 2 or 3 days, he'll know about Rottenroot. Grix listened. He did the math. 200 orcs aren't 30. It's an army. A real one. One that can't be dealt with by traps and ambushes in the gorge. Against 200 orcs, you need a wall. You need crossbows. You need discipline. You need everything he's been building for a month and a half. And he needed more. He called a council. All the centurions. Ush, Pix. He spread out a map, a large one, on a whole clay slab that Pix had fired in the kiln. He pointed it out. Gorak in the north. 200 orcs, heading this way. In 3 or 4 days, he'll be at Rottenroot. The wall isn't finished. The southern section is still only waist high. The gate is weak. The moat is shallow. 90 crossbows. 1 ballista, and it's untested. 320 combat-ready goblins. The remaining 200 are children, old people, the wounded, and those not yet trained. 3 to 2 isn't in the goblins' favor, by number. In terms of strength, 1 orc is worth 5 goblins in open combat. So the odds aren't 3 to 2. The odds are 1 to 3. Against us. Mord said they'd fight. Rattail's chief said we could leave, abandon Rottenroot, head south, deep into the hills, where the orcs won't find us. Grix shook his head. He said that if we leave now, Rottenroot will fall, the walls will be destroyed, the workshop will be burned, the fields will be trampled. Everything we've built over the past month and a half will turn to dust. And what's worse, the goblins will see that their city has been destroyed, that the walls didn't help, that it was all for nothing. And then faith would die. That small, fragile faith that had only just begun to take root. Faith that goblins might not be trash. If Rottenroot falls without a fight, every goblin in the horde will think the same thing. It can't be done. It won't work. We really are trash. And then it's the end. Not of the horde. Of the idea. Mord nodded. Rattail's chieftain was silent for a moment. Then he nodded too. Grix began preparing the defenses. 3 days. He had 3 days. Finishing the southern wall. But a palisade could be erected. Quickly, roughly. Logs dug into the ground. Not a stone wall, but an obstacle. Deep in the moat. Stakes at the bottom. An old trick that had worked from day 1. It works now, too. Crossbows on the walls, all 90 of them. On the northern wall, which is stone and sturdy. On the western wall. On the eastern wall. Keep a reserve for the southern palisade. Place Pix's ballista at the highest point. On the rock at the entrance to the caves. From there, the entire approach is as clear as day. Grix ordered Pix to test the ballista. Now. Immediately. Pix turned pale. He said he hadn't tested it yet. That the crossbow was stiff and might break. That the bolt was heavy and might fly off course. Grix said that in 3 days, 200 orcs would march through this valley. And the ballista would either work or it wouldn't.
There would be no third option. Pix nodded. He dragged the ballista up onto the rock. He set it up. 4 goblins turned the winch. The bowstring, woven from tendons as thick as a finger, tightened. A bolt as long as an arm with a bone tip settled into the chamber. Pix took aim. Downward. At the log they dug into the ground as a target 100 paces away. He pulled the trigger. A crack, a whistle, an impact. The log split in 2. The bolt went right through and stuck into the ground 10 paces further on. Silence. Pix stood with his mouth open. Grix stood with his closed. Because if he'd opened it, he would have shouted with joy. A log, right through, 100 paces away. An orc shield made of planks no thicker than that log. It meant that a ballista could pierce the orc shield and the orc behind it. At 100 paces. 1 ballista. Grix looked at Pix and said 2 words. 1 more. Pix blinked, said it was impossible in 3 days. Grix said then in 2, and gave him 10 assistants and the entire supply of ironwood, and lived. Pix didn't sleep for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, 2 ballistas stood on the rock. The second one was rougher than the first, a bit crooked. The gate creaked, but it fired. 80 paces instead of 100, also right through the log. Grix set up the defenses. The north wall was the main line. 60 crossbowmen, 3 rows of 20. The first row shoots, the second reloads, the third rests. Rotation, continuous fire. 2 ballistas on the cliff. They strike over the wall, at clusters, at the commanders, at those carrying ladders or battering rams if there are any. Blades behind the wall. 140 fighters in formation, 4 ranks. If the orcs climb over the wall, they'll face the formation. Reserve, 30 fighters, behind the caves, if they breach the wall, if they flank us, if everything goes to hell. The last line, children and the non-combatants deep in the caves. With Usha, she knows the passages that lead south through the mountain. If the walls fall, Ushsa will lead them away. Grix told her to leave if she hears 3 long horn blasts. 3 blasts mean all is lost. Ushsa looked at him. For a long time. She said she wouldn't leave. Grix said he would leave, because the children are more important than the walls, more important than the ore, more important than him. Children are the future. If they grow up and remember what happened, they will rebuild. Ushsa lowered her eyes. She nodded. On the morning of the 3rd day, fog, thick, cold. Grix stood on the wall and looked north. Nothing was visible. A white haze. Sounds. Muffled. Distant. Footsteps. Many footsteps. Heavy. Steady. A thudding. A drum. A low, rhythmic beat. An orc war drum. They were coming. Grix gripped the edge of the wall. The stone was cold and wet. His hands were shaking. He looked at his hands. Small. Green. With broken claws. Hands that couldn't lift an orcish axe. Hands that had never struck an enemy. Useless hands. But his mind was working. The fog began to lift. First shadows, then silhouettes, then figures. Orcs emerged from the fog like demons from the underworld. Huge, in leather armor, with axes and shields. 200. Grix counted. Row after row. 10 in a row. 20 rows. 200. Gorak led the way. Grix didn't recognize him by his appearance, by the way the others parted for him. Gorak wasn't the largest, but he moved like someone who didn't need to be pushed aside. They parted of their own accord before him. He stopped 200 paces away. He looked at the wall, at the battlements, at the archers, at the ballistas on the cliff, silently, for a long time. Then he turned to his men and said something. The orcs began to form ranks, not a crowd, a line, shield to shield, professionally. Gorak really was different. Drakkar would have thrown the orcs head on. Gorak was forming a line. Grix watched and felt a chill run down his spine. A clever enemy.
the most dangerous kind. The orcs advanced, not running, marching, steady, heavy, shields raised, a wall of shields, an orc phalanx, crude but effective. The bolts would strike the shields, not the bodies. 150 paces, 120, 100. Grix shouted to the ballistas. 2 ballistas fired, simultaneously. 2 bolts as long as a hand pierced the wall of shields like a knife through paper. The first went through a shield, through the orc behind it, and through the shield of the orc behind that one. 2 orcs fell, shields scattered, a hole in the ranks. The second bolt hit the edge of the line, shattered a shield. An orc flew back. The ranks wavered. Gorak roared. The orcs ran, closed the gaps. 80 paces. Grix shouted for the crossbows. 60 bolts, a volley. The shields took most of them, but not all. 7 orcs fell. Reload, a volley, 5 more.
The ballistas were reloading. Slowly. The mechanism is stiff. 4 goblins are cranking it. It takes a long time. 20 seconds. 20 seconds on the battlefield is an eternity. The orcs were at the wall. 60 paces. 40. 20. The third volley from the crossbows. Point-blank range. At 20 paces, a bolt pierces an orc's shield. 10 orcs collapsed. But the rest made it. They slammed into the wall, literally, with their bodies. The wall shook. Stones rained down. The orcs were climbing, clinging to the edge, hoisting each other up. The goblins on the wall jabbed their spears downward, into faces, into hands, into fingers clinging to the stones. One orc climbed over, jumped inside, crashed into the ranks, swept 4 aside. Mord rushed at him, a blade to the side, under the arm. The orc spun around. The axe nearly took Mord's head off. Mord crouched, struck at the knee. The orc fell. 3 goblins swarmed him. Another climbed over, then another. The line took them on. One by one, each was met by 5, 6, 10. An orc kills a goblin in a one-on-one fight, but 1 against 10, he falls. The ballista struck again. The bolt flew over the wall and slammed into a group of orcs below. 2 flew away like rag dolls. Gorak stood behind them, watching. Grix saw him from the wall. The orc chieftain stood and watched as his orcs got stuck in the wall like flies in tar. As every one who climbed over got 10 blades. As the ballistas pierced the shields. As the crossbow fire didn't stop for a second. Gorak raised his hand. The orcs retreated. They ran back 100 paces. They regrouped. Grix counted. Bodies lay on the field before the wall. Orcs. Grix counted. 38. 38 orcs, killed and unable to move. 162 remained. The Horde's losses. 11 dead, 20 wounded. The wall held. But the orcs hadn't left. Gorak was reorganizing, regrouping, dividing them into 3 units. Grix saw it. 3 strikes from 3 sides. North,
West, east, simultaneously. Stretch the defenses. Find a weak spot. Break through.
Grix moved the reserves to the western wall, part of the crossbowmen to the eastern. Stretched out, thin, dangerous. Gorak struck again, from 3 sides. The northern wall took the brunt of the attack. 100 orcs, 20 on the western wall, 40 on the eastern. Grix rushed back and forth between the walls. He shouted orders. He shuffled his men. Picks on the cliff fired the ballista without pause. Bolt after bolt. The gate creaked. The goblins gripped it until their palms bled. The eastern wall cracked. Stones rained down. Orcs poured through the breach. 20. They met them. But the formation was thin. A single row. The orcs pushed through. The goblins retreated. 2 fell. 3. Grix shouted for reinforcements to the east. 30 fighters ran. They crashed into the orcs who had broken through from the side. The line was restored. The breach was closed. But there were no more reserves. The northern wall held. Mord stood in the center and roared.
His hide was lacerated, blood was flowing down his left arm, but he stood, and those around him stood. Because if Mord stands, then we can stand. If Mord doesn't run, then we can't run. The Western Wall. 20 orcs were pressing in. Rat-Tail's chieftain held his ground. His fighters were the fiercest in the horde. Former slaves, former fugitives. They knew what a pen was, and they preferred to die standing. The battle lasted 2 hours. 2 hours of screams and blood, and the crash of stones and the whistling of bolts. 2 hours in which Grix lived 10 years. Then Gorak drove the orcs back, again, this time farther, 300 paces beyond the range of the crossbows. Grix watched from the wall. He counted the bodies on the field. Over 60 orcs lay before Rottenroot. 60 out of 200. 140 remained, but Grix had killed 29. Over 40 were wounded. 250 remained combat ready. The eastern wall had been breached. The southern palisade was untouched, but that was because Gorak hadn't struck there yet. There were enough crossbow bolts left for 2 volleys, 4 ballista bolts. He stood on the wall and knew he wouldn't survive a third attack. Gorak stood on a hill 300 paces away and knew it too. Grix saw the orc chieftain looking at the walls, counting, weighing his options. A clever enemy, the most dangerous kind. Gorak was preparing a third attack. Grix saw the orcs forming up, all 140 of them, in a single fist, one strike at the northern wall, with their full weight, to break through and flood the city. Grix closed his eyes, opened them, looked at Mord, at Rat-Tail's chieftain, at the one-eared one, at Shark, at Zara, who stood by his side, waiting, at Pix on the rock, hugging the ballista and trembling, at the hundreds of goblins on the walls and beyond the walls. His goblins, his people, his responsibility. The horn. The orc horn began to sound. Grix took a deep breath and heard another sound. Behind him. From the south. A pounding. Many feet. He turned around. Goblins were emerging from behind the southern hill, hundreds of them, with axes and clubs. Leading the way was a large goblin with a single protruding fang and a broken right one. Grushak. Grushak's 400 goblins were marching toward Rottenroot, not in formation, in a mob, without crossbows and without discipline, with sticks and axes and fury in their eyes. Grushak stopped in front of the southern palisade. He looked at Grix on the wall. He shouted a single word. Open it. Grix opened the gate. 400 goblins surged inside. Grushak climbed onto the wall. He stood next to Grix. He looked at the orcs, at the 140 who were gathering for the final assault. He said he changed his mind, that his goblins had seen the smoke and heard the noise of battle, and that they'd gone on their own. He couldn't stop them, didn't want to, because if Rottenroot fell, they'd come for him tomorrow, and together they might not come. Grix nodded, said he was glad. Grusha grinned. He said it wasn't for Grix's sake, it was for his own people, because his goblins were already looking at Rottenroot and asking why they didn't have a wall, or letters, or graves with names, and he didn't know what to say. Gorak saw reinforcements. He saw hundreds of goblins on the walls. He heard the roar of 900 goblins. He stood on the hill, silent, thinking. Then he lowered his hand. The orc horn sounded the retreat. The orcs turned. They left, to the north, in silence. Gorak was the last. He turned once, looked at Rottenroot, at the walls, at the goblins, and Grix saw in his eyes something that had never been in any orc's eyes when looking at a goblin. Fear. After the battle, Grix did not celebrate. 29 dead, 29 names, 29 stones with markings. He buried them all the next day, personally. Each one. Usha stood nearby and called out the names. The keeper of names. She knew every one. 900 goblins stood around the graves, quiet. Even the children were silent.
Grushok stood apart and watched, at the marked stones, at the small mounds of earth, at Grix, who placed a hand on each stone and spoke the name aloud. Grushok turned to one of his own and spoke quietly, but Zara heard. She related to Grix later. Grushok said that in the 20 years of his reign, he had lost hundreds of goblins, and he didn't remember a single one by name. Not a single one. On the third day after the battle, Grix and Grushok sat by the fire. Just the two of them. No witnesses. A conversation that would decide everything. Grushok spoke first. He said he had seen the walls. He saw crossbows. He saw the formation. He saw ballistas. He saw graves. He saw how 211 goblins held off 200 orcs for 2 hours. He said that such a thing doesn't happen. That in his entire life, in his father's and grandfather's entire lives, not a single goblin had ever stood against an orc in open combat and won. He paused. Then he asked, "Who are you?" Grix stared at the fire. He was silent. Grushok said he knew Grix wasn't who he seemed to be. That a goblin doesn't speak like that, doesn't think like that, doesn't act like that. That behind the scrawny body of Rotten Root's junior commander, someone else was hiding. Grix was silent for a long time. Then he said it didn't matter who he was. What mattered was where he was leading them. Grushok shook his head. He said that for the leader of 400, it matters. Because if Grix is a demon, or a curse, or a trap, then Grushok won't lead his men after him. But if Grix is the one who truly wants to raise the green people, then Grushok will stand by his side. But he needs to know. Grix looked at the old leader, at the scars, at the broken, at the eyes that held 20 years of power and loss, and he made up his mind. He told the truth. Not all of it, just part of it. He said that his mind was not of this world, that he remembered another life, other wars, other peoples who rose from the mud, that he knew how to build walls and armies and states because he had seen others do it, not here, somewhere else. Grushok listened. He didn't interrupt. When Grix finished, the old chieftain was silent for a long time. Then he said that old Usha had told him about the songs, about a foreign mind in a goblin's body, about the prophecy. He said he didn't believe in prophecies, but he believed in the walls that stood, and in the graves with names, and that was enough. They came to an agreement that night. Grushok would not become a subordinate. Grushok would become a co-ruler, the Supreme Council, 2 voices, Grix and Grushok. In case of disagreement, the Centurion's vote would decide. Grushok's 400 would join the Horde. His fighters would be distributed among the hundreds. His chieftain status would remain. He was one of the founders. His name would be on the first stone of Rotten Root, next to Grix's name. Grushok nodded, shook hands, in the goblin way, by interlocking claws. In the morning, Grix announced it. The Horde now numbered over 900, almost 1,000. Reorganization, 10 100-man units, 10 centurions. Above them, 2 supreme chieftains, Grix and Grushok. Pix received the title of Chief Master and a separate 100. Not a combat unit, a production unit. 100 goblins who don't fight but build and forge and make crossbows. Usha received the title of Guardian, responsible for literacy training, names, and healing. Also a separate 100. Zara remained commander of the 5th, Intelligence and Secret Affairs. Grix created a law, not oral, written, on stone slabs. 42 characters of goblin riding. 14 rules. Every goblin of the Horde is equal before the law. Food is divided equally. The murder of a goblin is punishable by exile. Theft is punishable by 3 days of starvation. Children must learn to read and write. The dead are buried with their names. Every goblin has the right to speak at the council. No goblin may be sold or given to another race. 14 rules. Simple. Clear. Carved in stone. Grix placed the slab at the entrance to the cave. Everyone entering saw it first. He stood before the slab and thought of another slab, of the 10 Commandments, of the Code of Hammurabi, of the Magna Carta. All great peoples began with law.
The law says we are not a pack. We are not a mob. We are a people. We have rules. And these rules are stronger than any leader, even stronger than Grix. He himself obeys these rules, demonstratively, publicly. When one of the centurions offered Grix a double portion as supreme leader, Grix refused. In front of everyone, an equal share, as the law commands. Grushak watched. He was silent. Then he, too, refused the double portion. The old leader who had eaten first and more than anyone else for 20 years. He refused. Because of the law. That moment was worth more than any victory. A month after the battle, the 3rd month since the rebirth, Ganilo Korin was growing. The walls were restored, fortified, twice as thick, twice as high. The moat was deep, a 3-row palisade beyond the moat, towers at the corners, small, goblin-sized, but with platforms for crossbowmen and ballistae. There are now 6 ballistae. Pix had streamlined production, templates, standards, every detail identical. 200 crossbows, 300 blades, 400 shields, full armor for every combat-ready goblin. The fields were green, the first root crop harvest in a month. Mushroom farms in the caves were yielding steadily. Snares and hunting as before, but now as a supplement, not the mainstay. The horde fed itself, not lavishly, but steadily. The goblins were learning to read. Not 20, not 50. All of them. The children mastered literacy in a week, the adults in 3. The learning pyramid was working. Every literate person taught 5 others. Within a month, there were no illiterate goblins left in the horde. 1,000 goblins who could read and write. Grix sent messengers, far away, to the east, to the west, to the south, in all directions. Goblin runners from Zara's 100, fast, stealthy, with a single message, a tablet of fired clay inscribed with goblin symbols. The first written document in the history of the goblin people, addressed to other goblins. The text is simple. The horde stands. The horde is growing. The horde has defeated the orcs and held its ground. There is a place in the horde for every goblin, food and weapons and a name carved in stone. Come. They came. 10 at a time, 20 at a time, 5 at a time, every day. Hungry, beaten, broken. But still coming, because the clay tablet with letters that can be read is proof that someone taught the goblins to write. And if they taught them to write, they can teach them everything else. By the end of the 3rd month, the horde numbered 1,400 goblins. Rottenroot became a city. Small, rough, ugly by human standards, but a city, with walls, with laws, with workshops, with fields, with a school where children learned the alphabet, with a cemetery where stones bearing names stood. Grix stood on the wall in the evening and watched the sunset. A green moon rose above the hills. Down in the city, bonfires were burning. The goblins were having dinner. Not hiding, not flinching. The bonfires burned openly because there was no one to fear. The walls stand. The patrols walk. Ballistas on the towers. For the first time in 300 years, the goblins were burning fires without hiding. Grix watched this and thought that 1,400 was a lot, but not enough. Because a storm was coming soon. Not orcs. Worse. The world was beginning to take notice. Zara brought back rumors. Human merchants in the border villages spoke of the goblin city. Elven patrols saw smoke from the goblin bonfires. Orc clans discussed Gorak, who had turned his back on the goblins. The rumors spread in circles, and when they reached the capitals, the human king, the elven council, the great orcish Khan. Then the real storm will come. Grix knew. Artem had read history. Every time a small people rose up, the world tried to crush them. Israel, Singapore, Switzerland, every single one, without exception. The world doesn't like it when the underclass rises from its knees. He would be ready. He had to be. 6 months since his rebirth, Grick stood on the main tower of Rottenroot and didn't recognize the place where, 2.5 months ago, there had been an empty valley. A city. A real city. Stone walls twice the height of a goblin.
4 towers at the corners. A moat with water diverted from a mountain stream. A drawbridge on ropes. Oak gates, reinforced with iron that Pix had extracted from a vein deep within the cave. An iron vein. The first goblin mine. Pix found it by accident. He was exploring the distant tunnels of the cave complex and saw reddish-brown streaks in the rock. He gave it a try, chiseled out a piece, smelted it in a furnace. Iron. Not the best, but real. Ours. Not a trophy. Goblin. Extracted from a goblin mountain by goblin hands. The mine changed everything. Iron means weapons, as many as we want. Not 8 reforged human swords. Hundreds of blades, thousands of bolt heads, iron plates for spears. Grix hadn't slept for 3 nights when he found out about the mine. He drew up plans. Production, logistics, extraction, smelting, forging, assembly, conveyor belt. From stone in the mountain to a blade in a goblin's hand. Pix built a second furnace, a third, a fourth.
The workshop became a workshop.
The workshop became a factory. A word that didn't exist in the goblin language and that Grix invented all over again. The population grew. New ones arrived every week. Messengers with signs went farther and farther and returned with tens and hundreds. By the 6th month, the horde numbered 5,000. 5,000 goblins. 200 combat ready. 120 children and elders. 800 in manufacturing and agriculture. Rottenroot had expanded. A second wall went up behind the first, a third behind the second. Rings. Like Moscow. Like London. The city grew in rings. The inner ring, caves and workshops. The middle ring, living burrows. The outer ring, fields and pens for small livestock. The goblins learned to domesticate mountain goats. Milk. The first milk in the history of the goblin people. The children grew noticeably larger than those born in forest pits. Thicker bones, firmer muscles. Because of food every day. Because of milk. Because of a roof over their heads and warmth. Grix looked at the children and saw the future of the not now. In 5 years. In 10. The goblins who grew up well-fed, educated, and free would be a different race. Not physically, mentally. A goblin who has known since childhood that he is not trash fights differently than a goblin who was beaten from birth. The world was pressing down. The human kingdom sent an envoy, not to the goblins, to the boy, with a proposal for a joint strike against the goblin city. Zara intercepted the envoy. She didn't kill him. She read the letter. The human king was offering Gorak an alliance to destroy Rottenroot together, to divide the territory. The orcs take the northern forest, the humans take the hills, the goblins back into the pens, as it was, as it should be. Grix read the letter. He looked at Zara. He said to let the envoy go. Zara raised an eyebrow. Grix explained. Let the envoy reach Gorak. Let Gorak read it. Let him see that the humans are offering an alliance. And let him think it over. Because the humans are offering Gorak the northern forest. But Gorak already owns the northern forest. What are the humans offering him? His own. Gorak isn't a fool. Gorak knows that after the goblins are destroyed, the humans will turn on the orcs. As always. The eternal war. 300 years. Everyone betrays everyone. Grix wrote his letter, in Goblin, on a burnt clay tablet, addressed to Gorak. The text is short. The humans want an alliance to destroy us. Then they'll destroy you, as always. We propose something else. Let's leave each other alone. You have the north, we have the south. The border is the river. No pens, no meat. The goblins are no longer slaves. If you agree, send a reply. If not, we will wait. And we have ballistas. A goblin runner from Zara's 100 delivered the tablet. The reply came a week later. Not a tablet. Orcs don't write. An orc arrived. Alone. Unarmed.
With a white rag on a stick. The orcish sign of negotiations.
The orc delivered the message verbally. Gorak heard Grix's words. Gorak thinks. Gorak doesn't trust goblins. But Gorak doesn't trust humans either. Gorak won't attack yet. For now. Grix nodded. For now. That is enough. For now. Because while Gorak thinks, Grix builds, and time is on the side of the one who builds. The elves. Zara brought this news as well. The Elven Council is concerned. For the first time in 100 years, they are discussing goblins, not as pests, as a problem, a military one, political, strategic.